The dog came in from the rain like something the storm had coughed up and forgotten. 70 pounds of soaked German Shepherd, bleeding from both front paws, dragging its left hind leg across the wet linoleum of Hartwell General Hospital's emergency entrance at 3:17 in the morning. Security moved to intercept it. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl, didn't slow down. It walked past the front desk, past the waiting room, past two residents who pressed themselves against the wall, and stopped in front of a nurse. Nobody had been paying attention to all night. It dropped something at her feet. Then it sat down and waited. Before she could look at what it had left her, the dog locked eyes with her. And every person in that ER who happened to be watching felt the air shift in a way they couldn't explain. 7 men in civilian clothes rose from their seats simultaneously. One of them stared at the dog and said quietly, to no one in particular, that K9 was declared dead 3 years ago. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because stories like this one don't come around every week. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I put everything into this channel and I want to see exactly how far these stories have traveled. Now, stay with me, because you have absolutely no idea where this is going. Hartwell General sat at the edge of Calverton, Oregon, the kind of mid-sized city that had a decent waterfront, a university hospital people drove 2 hours to avoid, and a general medical center that handled everyone else. It was not the kind of place anything remarkable happened. The staff had learned to manage the monotony of overnight shifts with bad coffee, worse vending machine food, and the unspoken agreement that nobody talked too loudly about how understaffed they were. Emily Voss had been working the night shift in the ER for 3 years. She was 36, medium height, with the kind of posture that suggested someone who had once been trained to stand very still in difficult situations and had never quite stopped. Her hair was pulled back without ceremony. She wore no jewelry except a plain watch on her left wrist, the kind with a rotating bezel, the kind used for tracking elapsed time under pressure. Nobody at Hartwell had ever asked about the watch. Nobody had ever asked about much of anything regarding Emily Voss. She showed up, she worked, she went home. She never called in sick. She never complained about assignments. She handled the difficult patients with a calm that her colleagues read as detachment rather than discipline, and she had long since stopped correcting them. The charge nurse, Deborah Kowalski, had once described Emily to a floater as technically competent but hard to read. The floater had agreed because it was easier than asking what that actually meant. What it meant, practically speaking, was that Emily Voss was the person everyone called when a situation went sideways and none of the obvious solutions were working. She was also the person who never received formal credit for those moments, because she had a way of stepping back just before the resolution became visible to whoever was standing nearby with a title. She had learned that habit somewhere. Nobody at Hartwell knew where. It was 3:09 a.m. when the dog came through the door. Emily was finishing a reassessment on a construction worker named Dale Pryor, who'd lacerated 3 fingers on a table saw and was handling the pain with a combination of stoicism and increasingly colorful profanity. She had just finished re-examining his dressing when the automatic doors opened and let in a gust of cold Oregon rain and then the dog. She heard the commotion before she saw the animal. One of the security guards, Marcus, called out for someone to grab a leash. The other guard, a younger man named Pete, who'd been on the job about 4 months, physically stepped in front of the dog and held up both hands. The dog went around him without breaking stride. It wasn't aggressive. That was the thing nobody could articulate afterward. The dog wasn't behaving like a frightened stray or a loose animal panicking in an unfamiliar environment. It was moving with direction. It passed the triage desk. It passed the row of occupied waiting chairs. It passed a gurney being rolled through the corridor by 2 techs who flattened themselves against the wall. One of the overnight residents, a second-year named Okonkwo, who was deeply tired and deeply caffeinated, started toward it and then just stopped, because the dog's body language didn't invite interference. It stopped in front of Emily. It dropped something small and metal at her left foot. Then it sat. Emily looked down. The object was a military identification tag, rusted and dented, attached to a piece of paracord so worn it was nearly severed. She didn't touch it immediately. She looked at the dog first, assessed it the way she assessed incoming patients, systematically and without visible reaction. Both front paws were raw, pads cracked and bleeding. Left hind leg bore what she mentally categorized as a 3-week-old soft tissue injury, partially healed and re-aggravated. The animal was dehydrated. It had not eaten well in some time, but its eyes were clear and focused, and it was breathing steadily, and it was looking at her with an expectation that was specific in a way that unsettled her. "Easy," she said quietly. "Easy, big guy. You came a long way." Behind her, Dale Pryor had gone completely silent for the first time in 40 minutes. She crouched slowly and reached for the ID tag. The dog didn't move. She turned it over and tried to read the stamping under the ER's fluorescent light, but the corrosion had eaten most of the surface. What remained was a partial service number and 2 letters of a name. She was still looking at it when she became aware of the men. She'd noticed them earlier in the way she noticed most things in the waiting room, logged and filed, not actively processed. 7 men spread across 3 separate seating clusters, none of them interacting with each other in any obvious way. Civilian clothes. No visible injuries. No one accompanying them. They'd been there since at least 1 a.m., which was when she'd first come past the waiting area. People waited in ERs for all kinds of reasons. She had not flagged them, but now they were all standing, and they were not looking at the dog. They were looking at Emily. One of them, mid-40s, short hair going silver at the temples. The particular upright stillness of someone accustomed to maintaining posture under extended duress, said the words that stopped the room. That K9 was declared dead 3 years ago. Nobody moved for a long moment. The monitors beeped. Rain hit the windows. Emily stood up slowly and said, without looking away from the man, "Get me a mobile vet kit from the supply cabinet on the south wall, second shelf, and someone call Hartwell's after-hours vet liaison." "We don't have a vet on call," Pete said from behind her, still holding his hands up even though the dog had stopped moving. "Then call Dr. Malone in orthopedics and tell her I need her down here. She has a Malinois at home. She'll understand the anatomy." Emily finally looked away from the standing men and back at the dog. "And someone get me warm saline and a sterile dressing kit." The waiting room began moving again in the way emergency rooms do, not because the situation had resolved itself, but because a competent-sounding voice had issued instructions and people's bodies responded to that before their minds could fully process why. The silver-templed man walked toward her. "Ma'am," he said, and the word carried the particular formality of someone for whom honorifics were default rather than affectation. "I need to ask you a question." "You can ask while I work," Emily said, already moving toward the supply area. He followed her. "That dog's designation is K9 Ranger. I was assigned to a special operations unit operating out of a coastal installation. He was reported killed in action during a mission 38 months ago. His handler and 3 other personnel were listed as casualties. The case was closed." Emily opened the cabinet, found the kit, did not pause in her movements. "What kind of unit?" The man looked at her with an expression that rearranged itself slightly. "That's not public information." "I'm not the public," she said, and she said it without inflection, almost absently, the way someone says something true without intending it to land as a statement. She pulled out the saline. "Ranger, is that what you said his name was?" "Yes." "How long has he been missing?" 38 months. Emily turned back toward the dog with her supplies. "His paws have been damaged repeatedly and partially healed multiple times. That pattern is consistent with extended rough terrain travel. The leg injury is a soft tissue tear, not a break, 3 to 4 weeks old. He's been compensating for it." She crouched beside the animal again. "He didn't wander here. He navigated here." The man was quiet for a moment. "What makes you say that?" "Because if he'd wandered, he'd have stopped at the first person who knelt down to him." She looked up briefly. "He didn't stop until he got to me." Something moved behind the man's eyes that she didn't have the bandwidth to interpret right then. "I'm Major Dolan," he said. "Who are you?" "Emily Voss, night shift nurse." She uncapped the saline. "And unless your guys have actual medical training, I need you to give me about 8 feet of working space." He stepped back. The other 6 men, who had drifted closer without Emily noticing, stepped back with him. She worked on Ranger for 40 minutes. The other staff gave her a wide berth, which was partly because the dog made it clear with body language that it didn't want strangers near it, and partly because Major Dolan had positioned his people in a loose perimeter around the treatment area without anyone formally agreeing that was what was happening. Dr. Malone came down from the 3rd floor in her street clothes, assessed the situation in about 15 seconds, and quietly began assisting without being asked, handing instruments and reading vitals in a way that required no verbal direction. That was when the first strange thing happened, if you were keeping count from the beginning of the night. Because Emily and Dr. Malone worked in the kind of coordinated silence that takes years to develop, and after about 10 minutes, Malone said very quietly, "You've done this before." It wasn't a question. Emily said, "Hold that compression." Malone held it. She didn't push the observation, but she watched Emily's hands on the dog's leg with the expression of someone recalibrating something. From across the room, Major Dolan watched too. He had said almost nothing since the introduction. He was good at that. The particular kind of patience that doesn't feel like waiting, it feels like assessment. His people knew to hold position and not create friction. What they hadn't prepared for, and what Dolan himself hadn't prepared for, was this specific variable. Ranger had made his choice when he walked through that door. Whatever the dog knew, whatever instinct or memory or learned association was driving him, he had selected this woman in this hospital in this city. And Dolan had been doing this work long enough to believe that military working dogs didn't make that kind of selection arbitrarily. He pulled out his phone and sent a short message. 3 minutes later, his phone vibrated. He read the response, looked up at Emily's back, and was very still for a long moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and waited. At 4:23 a.m., Ranger's condition had been stabilized to the extent possible without a surgical facility. He was resting on a folded thermal blanket Malone had sourced from somewhere, his breathing even, his eyes half closed but still tracking Emily's movements every time she stepped away. Emily was washing her hands at the basin when Deborah Kowalski materialized at her elbow. Deborah was 52 and had been a charge nurse for 16 years and was not easily rattled. She was rattled now, which she expressed by keeping her voice very low and her face very neutral. "Administration is asking questions," Deborah said. "About the dog?" "About the men. There are 7 of them, Emily. They've been here for hours. They haven't registered as patients. They're not visiting anyone. And 2 of them are standing outside the ambulance bay right now, and I'm pretty sure one of them is armed." "They probably all are," Emily said. Deborah stared at her. "I wouldn't worry about it," Emily said. She dried her hands. "They're not a threat to the hospital." "How do you know that?" Emily looked at her. "Because if they were a threat to the hospital, we'd already know." Deborah processed this for a moment. "Who are these people?" "I'm still working that out." She was lying, slightly. She had a good hypothesis already. She just needed one more piece of information to confirm it, and she thought that information was about to arrive because Major Dolan was walking toward her with the deliberate pace of someone who had made a decision. "Can we talk somewhere?" he said. "Sure. Walk with me." She headed toward the small family consultation room off the main corridor. Not because it was ideal, but because it had a window that faced the parking lot, which she wanted to be able to see. Dolan followed her in. One of his people moved to the doorway and took up a position outside it without being told to. Emily leaned against the windowsill, facing him. "You ran me," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of the sequence of events." "Yes," he said. "And?" He looked at her for a moment. "The name Emily Voss shows up in our records as a contracted medical professional who worked briefly with a civilian support organization that had some interface with one of our installations about 9 years ago. That's everything in the file." "That's not nothing," she said. "No, it's not nothing." He paused. "But it doesn't explain what I just watched you do with that dog." Emily said nothing. Dolan took a breath. Ranger was assigned to a unit operating under classified protocols. His handler was Captain Seth Hargrove. Hargrove and 2 other operators were listed as killed in action during an operation on the coast approximately 38 months ago. The installation they were operating from was officially decommissioned. The mission was closed. He paused again. 2 weeks ago, we intercepted communications that suggested parts of that mission were never actually closed. The rain against the window had slowed to a steady drizzle. In the parking lot, Emily could see 2 additional vehicles that hadn't been there at the start of her shift. Dark SUVs with no markings, parked near the far edge of the lot. "What kind of communications?" she asked. "The kind that suggest Captain Hargrove may still be alive." The room was very quiet. Emily looked at Dolan steadily. "And then the dog showed up here." "Yes." "With a tag." "Which we'd like to examine, if you're willing." She had put the tag in her scrub's pocket. She reached in now and held it out to him. He took it carefully. pulled a small evidence bag from inside his jacket, and dropped it in. "There's a partial service number," she said. "The corrosion ate most of it, but the last 4 digits are visible under better light. We'll process it." He looked at her. "Ms. Voss, I need to ask you directly. Do you have any prior connection to Captain Hargrove or to the unit he served with?" Emily looked at the window. Outside, one of the SUVs had its parking lights on now. As she watched, a third vehicle turned into the lot. "I need to get back to my patients," she said. "Ms. Voss, ask me again in an hour, Major." She pushed off the windowsill. "Right now, your dog needs monitoring. My department needs coverage. And whatever brought you to this hospital tonight isn't going to resolve itself in this room." She walked past him and back into the corridor. Dolan stood in the family consultation room for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "She's not what the file says," he said when someone answered. "Get Colonel Whitmore on the line." The hour between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. in an emergency department is a strange stretch of time. The worst of the late-night arrivals have either been treated or admitted or sent home, and the early morning cases haven't started coming in yet. It's a lull that feels briefly like the building is exhaling. Emily used it to think. She moved through her remaining tasks, checked on Dale Pryor, who had finally stopped complaining and fallen asleep in Bay 4, documented 2 cases she'd been holding off on, did a supply check for the next shift. Her hands stayed busy, her mind stayed somewhere else. Ranger had found her. That was the part she kept returning to. Not the men, not the tag, not whatever Dolan was working himself up to reveal. Those things she could deal with as they came. But the dog had walked into this hospital and passed every other person in it and stopped specifically in front of her. She hadn't treated Ranger before. She was almost certain of that. She'd treated other military working dogs, 4 of them. During a period of her life, she'd spent a significant amount of effort leaving behind. But not this one. Not a dog with this designation. So why her? She was at the nurse's station, staring at a monitor without seeing it, when Malone appeared beside her again. "He's sleeping," Malone said, meaning Ranger. "Vitals are good. Whatever happens with his leg, the immediate crisis is managed." She set her stethoscope on the counter. "You want to tell me what's going on?" "Not particularly." "Those men aren't here by accident." "No." "And you know something about why?" Emily was quiet. Malone picked up her stethoscope. "Okay, I'm not going to push it." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, the way you worked on that dog tonight, that wasn't nursing. That was something else." She left before Emily had to respond. From his folded blanket in the corner of Bay 2, Ranger watched Emily across the room. His eyes were half closed but tracking. Every time she moved, his gaze followed. At 4:58 a.m., the automatic doors opened. A woman walked in wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, and she moved through the space with the kind of authority that didn't require identification. She went directly to Dolan, exchanged about 12 words with him, and then looked across the room at Emily. She was in her early 50s, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who had learned to carry weight without showing it. She had a small scar on her jaw that wasn't surgical. Her eyes were the kind of clear that comes from years of having to see things accurately. She crossed the room. "Emily Voss," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's right. I'm Colonel Sandra Whitmore. I oversee the unit that K9 Ranger was assigned to." She paused. "I knew that dog was still alive. I've believed it for 30 months. Nobody was willing to allocate resources to a search based on a feeling." She looked over at where Ranger was sleeping. Something crossed her face briefly and then was gone. "He walked past every other person in this building." "He did," Emily said. "I've spent the last 4 hours learning everything I can find about you on very short notice." Whitmore looked back at her. "The file is thin. That's not an accident, is it?" Emily didn't answer. "I'm not here to press you on your history," Whitmore said. "I'm here because whatever Ranger found his way here to start, I intend to finish it. And I think you know more about what he's been carrying than you've told my major." Emily looked at her steadily. "I looked at the tag. That's it." "Did you?" Whitmore reached into her jacket and produced a small photograph. Printed, not digital, the kind of photo you kept as backup when you didn't trust a signal. She held it out. Emily took it. It was a photograph of Ranger, younger, standing beside a man in tactical gear at the edge of what appeared to be a coastal promontory. The man's face was partially obscured by his helmet, But behind them, just barely visible in the background, was a structure Emily recognized, not because of any name or signage, but because of the angle of the roofline and the specific configuration of the antenna array above it. She had seen that building before, not in a photograph, in person. Her hands did not move. Her face did not change. But something in her chest tightened in a way that she hadn't felt in a very long time. And she was very careful, in that moment, not to let Colonel Whitmore see it. She handed the photograph back. "Interesting picture," she said. Whitmore watched her. "The structure in the background. Do you recognize it?" "Old radar installation," Emily said. "Decommissioned. There are several along this stretch of coast." "There are," Whitmore agreed. "But that particular one has come up in the communications we intercepted." She put the photograph away. "We're going to need to move quickly on this. If Hargrove is alive, he's been isolated for 38 months with whatever resources he had when the operation collapsed. That is not a sustainable situation." Emily was quiet for a moment. In the corner, Ranger stirred. He lifted his head, looked directly at Emily, and put it down again. "What do you need from me?" Emily said. Whitmore looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been doing this long enough to appreciate a direct question. "Right now," she said, "I need you to finish your shift, and I need you to not go anywhere when it's done." She paused. "And I need you to tell me honestly whether there is any possibility that you know more about that installation than a civilian nurse working a regional ER should know." The rain had almost stopped. Through the window of Bay 2, the parking lot was filling with first light, that thin gray Oregon pre-dawn that didn't so much arrive as seep in from the edges. Emily looked at the window. She looked at Ranger. She looked at Colonel Whitmore. "I'll finish my shift," she said. Whitmore nodded once. "Get some rest after," she said. "You're going to need it." She walked back toward Dolan and his people, and Emily watched her go, and then turned back to the nurse's station, and stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the counter. The ID tag was gone from her pocket. She'd given it to Dolan. But she hadn't told anyone what she'd read in the partial stamping before the corrosion. The two letters that remained of a name barely visible that she'd deciphered not because they were clear, but because she knew what to look for. Those two letters weren't Hargrove. They were from a different name entirely, a name nobody in this building had mentioned, a name she hadn't heard in 9 years. She picked up a chart and started reading it without seeing a single word. Across the room, the dog kept watching her, and outside, the SUVs in the parking lot had quietly multiplied to 5. Her shift ended at 7. She stayed until 7:40 because the incoming nurse, a young man named Torres, who was perfectly competent on his good days, came in with the particular hollow look of someone running on 4 hours of sleep and emotional residue from whatever had happened the night before in his personal life. Emily didn't ask. She handed off her cases with clean documentation, answered his questions without impatience, and waited until his hands stopped shaking slightly before she signed out. Small things. Nobody noticed them. That was fine. She changed in the locker room, pulled on jeans and a gray sweatshirt, and stood at her locker for a moment longer than necessary. The combination lock had a scratch on the third dial that she'd noticed 8 months ago and never reported. She looked at it now without seeing it. The two letters on the tag had been M and A, not Ha from Hargrove, not any abbreviation that pointed toward the names Whitmore and Dolan had been using all night. The letters came from a different name, a name belonging to a man who, according to every official record Emily had any access to, had been dead for 6 years, killed not in action, not in any operation, but in a training accident at an installation whose official designation she had memorized and tried very hard to forget. His name had been Marcus Avery, and he had been her commanding officer. She closed the locker, shouldered her bag, and walked out of the hospital into a morning that was cold and damp and smelled like wet pavement and pine from the hills above Calverton. The parking lot had returned to something approximating normal. The 5 SUVs had reduced to 2, both now positioned near the main entrance, and a man she hadn't seen before, younger than Dolan's group, wearing a jacket with no branding, was leaning against a pillar near the exit with his hands in his pockets and his eyes tracking her from the moment the door opened. She walked to her car without acknowledging him. She was 3 steps from the driver's door when she heard footsteps behind her that were too deliberate to be casual. "Colonel Whitmore would like a word," the young man said. "I'm aware," Emily said. She unlocked the car, put her bag on the passenger seat, and turned around. "Tell her I'll be at the Linden Street coffee shop in 20 minutes. The young man blinked. That wasn't the answer he'd been briefed for. She was expecting you'd come back inside. I know, 20 minutes, Linden Street. She got in the car and drove. The coffee shop was called Marta's, and it had been open since 5 a.m. and smelled like burnt grounds, an industrial cleaner, which Emily found clarifying. She ordered black coffee, took the table in the back corner that faced the door, and sat down. Whitmore arrived in 17 minutes, alone, which was either a concession or a test. She ordered nothing at the counter and sat across from Emily without preamble. "You were military," Whitmore said. "I've heard that question phrased as a question before." "I'm past the question phase." Whitmore set her phone on the table face down. "We ran deeper after our conversation. The records are clean, too clean. Civilian nursing credentials, state licensure, employment history. Going back 11 years with no gaps and nothing before that connects to any military branch. That kind of file doesn't appear on its own." Emily drank her coffee. "You had help building it," Whitmore said. "Colonel, what is it you actually need from me? Because you've had 12 hours and the resources of a special operations unit, and you still don't have a solid location on a man who might be alive in a structure within probable driving distance of this city. That tells me you have incomplete information. And that makes me wonder what you think I know that fills the gap." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. Outside, a city bus moved past the window. "The intercepted communications referenced a name," Whitmore said. "Not Hargrove, a different name. We've been running it since last night and we can't place it anywhere in the active records." She looked at Emily steadily. "The name was Avery." The coffee cup was warm against Emily's palms. She kept her hands around it. "What was the context?" she said. "Supply route coordination. Someone was communicating about maintaining a supply line to a coastal location, and they used that name as an identifier. A contact name, possibly. Or a code." Whitmore paused. "Does it mean anything to you?" Emily set the cup. She'd known, in the back of the part of her brain that never fully stood down, that this conversation was coming from the moment she'd read the tag. She'd had the walk to her car and the drive here, and the 17 minutes alone at this table to decide how she was going to handle it. She had not reached a clean conclusion, which was unusual for her, and which told her something about what this particular piece of information was doing to the architecture of her composure. "Marcus Avery was a captain in a special operations medical unit," she said. "He was declared killed in a training accident at Coastal Installation 7, 6 years ago. I served under him for 2 years prior to his death." Whitmore did not move. "I was his senior medical specialist," Emily continued. "The unit worked in field medical support for covert operations along the Pacific coast. Irregular schedules, rotating call signs, minimal documentation by design. When Avery died, the unit was disbanded and the personnel were redistributed or transitioned. I transitioned out." "What do you mean by transitioned?" "I mean I left." Emily looked at her. "I was given the option to continue in a new assignment or separate. I separated. I built a new file which you've apparently found the edges of, and I have been working at Hartwell General for 3 years." Whitmore absorbed this. "You're telling me you were Special Operations Medical?" "I'm telling you I was trained by someone who was." The distinction mattered a great deal to Avery, administratively. She paused. "He didn't like paperwork that complicated his personnel structure." "Was his death legitimate?" The question landed flat on the table between them. Emily had asked herself that question approximately 10,000 times over 6 years. The answer she'd arrived at was not simple, and it was not one she had ever said out loud to anyone. "I don't know," she said. Whitmore leaned forward slightly. "But you have doubts." "I had doubts. I also had a new name, a new license, and a hospital that needed coverage on the overnight shift. So I filed the doubts and kept working. Until last night." "Until last night," Emily agreed. Whitmore picked up her phone, unlocked it, and laid it on the table facing Emily. On the screen was a satellite image, gray and low resolution, the kind produced by a pass rather than targeted surveillance. It showed a coastal promontory, a narrow access road, and a structure that Emily recognized with a physical sensation she hadn't expected, a tightening in her chest that was not quite pain and not quite grief, but was located somewhere between the two. The antenna array on the roof, the angle of the eastern wall, the way the structure sat into the hillside rather than on top of it, a deliberate integration designed to reduce the visible profile from the water. She had been inside that building. Kessler Point, Emily said quietly. You know it. That's where Avery's unit operated from. That's where I was stationed. She looked up from the phone. When was this taken? 72 hours ago. The building was assessed as abandoned during the Installation 7 decommission. These images suggest recent activity. Vehicle tracks, modified entry points, what appears to be a generator exhaust port that wasn't in the original structural documentation. Emily looked at the image for a long moment. Someone retrofitted it after the official closure. That's our conclusion. And you think Hargrove is there? We think someone is there. Whether it's Hargrove or someone else or multiple people, we don't know. The communications intercept triangulated to within 4 kilometers of that location. Whitmore retrieved the phone. We're putting together a rapid assessment team. We move within 48 hours. Emily sat back. What do you want from me, Colonel? Specifically. You know that building, the layout, the access points, whatever structural modifications were made during your unit's operation. You know the terrain, the approach vectors, the kind of medical situation we might find if someone has been there for any extended period. Whitmore looked at her without softening the ask. I want you to come with us. Emily was quiet. From the counter, Marta's single morning employee was arguing on the phone about a delivery schedule. The fluorescent light above the back table buzzed slightly at the left end. Rain had started again outside, a thin mist that fogged the lower third of the window. I'm a nurse, Emily said. Yes, Whitmore said. You are. The way she said it indicated she understood this was not actually an argument. Emily picked up her coffee. I'll need a medical kit. Full trauma load, not a field first aid bag. And I need at least 6 hours of sleep before you put me in a vehicle. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression. Not relief exactly, more like the quiet calibration of someone who'd made the correct calculation. We'll have a kit ready, she said. 6 hours. I'll have someone outside your building. I know. Emily finished the coffee. I already spotted him in the parking lot. She slept badly, which she'd expected. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted building on Heron Street. Small, functional, with one window that faced west toward the hills and another that faced the alley, which she preferred. She had not decorated it in any way that would tell a visitor things about her. There were books stacked horizontally because she owned more than the shelf allowed. There was a kitchen table she used as a desk. There was a plant near the west window that was alive mainly because it was the kind of plant designed to survive neglect. She lay down at 9:15 and was still looking at the ceiling at 10. The thing about Marcus Avery was not the grief. The grief had been real and it had been significant, and she had processed it with the determined practicality she applied to most things that threatened to take up too much space inside her. What remained, 6 years later, was not grief, but rather a specific and persistent sense of wrong geometry. The shape of what she'd been told about his death did not fit the space left by his absence, and she had never been able to make those two things align. Training accident. Marcus Avery had been one of the most technically precise people she had ever known. Not reckless, not careless. The kind of person who checked equipment twice before other people checked it once, not out of anxiety but out of habit built over years of situations where imprecision had consequences. The official account described a failure of basic safety protocol during a live fire exercise. She had read it 4 times. She had called the investigation officer twice and been told the case was closed. She had filed 2 formal requests for the full incident report and received heavily redacted versions that answered no questions she actually had. And then she had stopped. Not because she'd been told to stop, though she had been, firmly, once. But because she had made a calculation, she could spend the rest of her career pulling at a thread that had been deliberately buried, or she could take the exit that was being quietly offered to her and build something she could actually live in. She had chosen the latter. She was not certain, lying on her back in her apartment with a military team parked outside the building, that she had made the right choice. At 11:40, she gave up on sleep and made coffee and stood at the west window, watching clouds move over the hills. At some point, she pulled out her phone and looked at the time and then looked at nothing for a while. At 12:30, she went back to bed and fell asleep for 3.5 hours. It was not restful sleep. She dreamed about Kessler Point, not the building itself, but the approach. The coastal road that narrowed to a single lane and wound along the bluff face with the ocean 70 feet below on the left and basalt outcroppings on the right that caught the wind and made a sound she had never heard anywhere else. In the dream, she was driving, and it was always about to be dawn and the road was empty. She knew what was at the end of it. She didn't get there. She woke at 4:10 in the afternoon. Dolan was parked in front of her building in a dark vehicle she could see from the window. She dressed, drank water, checked the time, assembled nothing because she had nothing to assemble. She would be issued equipment or she wouldn't, and either way she was not going to Kessler Point as Emily Voss, the civilian. She hadn't fully defined what she was going as, but she understood that the category had shifted sometime between 3 a.m. and this moment, and she was still working out how she felt about that. She went downstairs and got in the vehicle. Dolan didn't look at her. He pulled out from the curb and drove. "We have a briefing location 20 minutes from here," he said. "Colonel Whitmore is already there with the team lead." "How many people?" 8-person assessment element, plus you." Emily looked at the passing street. "Who's the team lead?" "Captain Nora Shen. She's been with the unit 4 years. She's good." "What does she know about me?" Dolan was quiet for a moment. "That you have relevant knowledge of the target location." "That's all?" "That's what Colonel Whitmore told her." Emily nodded. That meant there would be a period during which Shen would treat her as a civilian asset with locational knowledge. And then there would be a period during which that assessment would have to be revised. And the transition between those two periods was going to be interesting. The briefing location was a rented industrial space on the south edge of Calverton, the kind of anonymous building used for storage or light manufacturing that attracted no particular attention. Inside, the main floor had been partially converted: tables, screens, equipment cases, a portable generator humming in the corner. 6 people were already present, in various stages of gear preparation or standing at the map table. Whitmore was at the back wall. The woman next to her, reviewing something on a tablet, had the economical build and focused attention of someone who had made deliberate choices about where she spent her physical energy. She looked up when Emily came in. Captain Norishin was approximately 32, East Asian features, hair pulled into a tight coil at the base of her neck. She assessed Emily in the way competent operators assessed everything, quickly, without making a performance of it. Her expression showed neither warmth nor hostility. "Ms. Voss," she said, "Colonel Whitmore says you know the target structure." "I was stationed there, roughly 7 years ago." Emily came to the map table. "What's the current egress assessment?" Shen's eyes moved across her face briefly. "Single paved road access, confirmed. North face has a secondary footpath that runs down to the shoreline, but the condition is unknown after this many years. We're assuming degraded." She turned the tablet to face Emily, showing a schematic. "This is the documented floor plan from the original installation record. Does it match your memory?" Emily studied it. "Mostly. The western annex was expanded during our operation, additional storage and a secondary medical bay. It's not in that plan." She traced the modification with one finger. "And the roof access is on the north side, not marked here. There's an internal ladder from the 3rd-level corridor." Shen looked at her. "Medical bay. Field medical support was part of the unit's function. Equipment was brought in after the original build." Shen glanced at Whitmore, who said nothing. "Okay," Shen said. "Walk me through what you remember about interior layout, room by room." Emily spent 40 minutes doing exactly that. She was thorough, and she was precise, and she cross-referenced against the schematic at every point, correcting where the record was wrong and confirming where it was accurate. The team gathered by degrees, not making a production of it, pulling in around the table as Emily talked. Because the information was useful, and people who know useful information command a certain gravity regardless of their official status. At the end of it, Shen looked at her with an expression that had moved some distance from its starting point. "You remember the interior of a building you were in 7 years ago better than most of my people remember last week's briefing notes," she said. "I have a good memory for structures," Emily said. Shen accepted this without visibly accepting it. The briefing moved into operational parameters. Whitmore took the lead, walking through the intercept data, the satellite imagery timeline, the risk assessment. 48 hours had compressed since the overnight conversation at Marta's. They were moving at first light tomorrow, which meant a 4:30 departure and a coastal approach timed to arrive at Kessler Point as dawn came over the hills. Emily listened. She asked 2 questions. She did not volunteer information beyond what was asked. At 7 p.m., Whitmore called a break. People dispersed toward equipment cases or the folding table that had been set up with food. Emily went to the corner near the generator and stood with a bottle of water and thought about the medical bay at Kessler Point. Specifically, what would remain functional after years of unofficial use with presumably limited resupply. Shen materialized beside her. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Shen said. "You can ask. How long were you stationed there?" "About 20 months. "And you separated when the unit disbanded?" "Yes." Shen looked at the floor for a moment. "I've done 4 missions in the last 2 years that came back to Kessler Point in the background data. Intercepted comms, financial traces, equipment sourcing. Whatever has been happening at that location, it didn't start recently. This goes back at least 5 years. She looked up. "That's before our intercept capability picked it up. That's around the time your unit was still active." Emily met her eyes. "I know," Emily said. "What do you know exactly?" "I know that toward the end of my time at Kessler Point, the supply chain for the unit started producing anomalies. Equipment arriving with inconsistent documentation, resupply schedules that didn't match the operational calendar. I flagged it twice through the reporting structure." She paused. Both times it was explained as administrative error. Shen's jaw was steady. "Did you believe that?" "I believed it enough to continue working. I had patience." Emily looked across the room at the schematic still displayed on the screen. Avery didn't believe it. Shen was very still. "Avery. Captain Marcus Avery. He commanded the unit. He was—" She stopped, adjusted. "He died 6 years ago." "I know who he is," Shen said quietly. "His name came up in the intercept." "I know. Whitmore told me." "She told you it was a contact name, a possible code." Shen paused. "She didn't tell you what else was in the same communication." Emily looked at her. Sheen reached into her jacket and produced a folded, printed sheet. She held it out. Emily took it. It was a partial transcription, raw intercept data, partially decoded, with redactions throughout. She scanned it. Most of it matched what Whitmore had described. Supply route coordination, location references that triangulated to Kessler Point. The name Avery appeared twice as an identifier, and then, near the bottom of the page, a phrase that had not been redacted, which she suspected was deliberate. "Confirm package status with Avery. He knows they're coming." Emily read it twice. She folded the paper. Her hands were completely steady, and her face was completely neutral, and internally she was doing something she rarely did, which was recalibrate everything she thought she understood about the last 6 years all at once. "He knows they're coming," she said. "Yes," Shen said. "That's present tense." "That's present tense," Emily handed the paper back. "When did you get this?" "That specific intercept is 41 hours old," Shen put it away. "Whitmore knows. She's known since before she walked into that hospital last night." She looked at Emily directly. "I'm telling you because you're going to be in that building tomorrow morning, and I think you deserve to be walking in with an accurate picture." Emily looked at the generator in the corner. It was a good generator. Industrial grade, barely audible at this distance. The kind of unit used for extended operations where noise discipline mattered. "Whitmore thought I might not come if she told me," Emily said. "I think she was trying to get you stabilized before adding pressure," Shun said. "She's not wrong that you're useful, but you're not useful if you're walking into that structure emotionally sideways." "I'm not emotionally sideways." Shen looked at her for a moment. "No," she said. "I don't think you are. That's actually what concerns me a little." She paused. "Are you going to be okay tomorrow?" Emily considered the question with more honesty than she showed. "Ask me when we get there," she said. Shen nodded once. She started to move away, then stopped. "One more thing. The dog. Ranger." She turned back. "He's at the veterinary facility on Powell Street. Hartwell's vet liaison brought him in this morning. He's stable. But when they brought him in, he would not settle until one of Dolan's people stayed in the room with him. He kept going to the door." "I know," Emily said. "You checked on him." "Before I went home, yes." Shun watched her. "He's been tracking east," she said. "When they give him room to move, he orients east, toward the coast." She paused. "He knows something is in that direction that isn't finished." Emily looked toward the exit of the building. Through the single high window near the roofline, the sky had gone the particular dark blue of an Oregon evening closing into night. "So do I," she said. They moved at 4:20 a.m. 3 vehicles, dark, moving south on 101, and then cutting west on the coast, access roads that the GPS in any standard vehicle would not have routed them onto. Emily was in the second vehicle with Shen and 2 of the operators, a man named Decker and a woman named Priya, who had not spoken to Emily beyond an initial nod, and who communicated with Shen through the kind of minimal gesture exchange that comes from a lot of shared field time. Emily sat with a medical kit at her feet and watched the road. The approach took 53 minutes. The last 8 miles were on unpaved track that had been maintained, she noted. The ruts were recent and the drainage channels on either side had been cleared. Someone had been keeping this road passable. Shen noticed the same thing. She said nothing, but Emily saw her hand signal to Decker. They stopped 400 meters from the structure. From here, on foot, through tree cover that had grown up along the bluff in the intervening years. The ocean was somewhere below them, and to the left, invisible in the dark, audible as a low, constant presence. Emily had her kit and wore a vest that Dolan's people had provided without being asked, which fit better than she'd expected, which told her someone had looked at her dimensions before the mission and thought ahead. Shen moved to the front of the column. They walked. The path through the trees was manageable. The undergrowth had thickened, but not impassably. Emily stayed behind Priya and ahead of Decker, moving with the pace the formation set, feeling the familiar compression in her chest that wasn't fear but was closely adjacent to it, the high-frequency alertness that she had last felt in a place very much like this and had spent 3 years in a hospital doing her best to convert into something useful. The structure came into view as they cleared the last stand of trees. It was bigger than the satellite images had suggested, or maybe she was remembering it as smaller. The eastern wall had been modified. A section that had been windows during her time, there was now solid panels, the kind of insulated boarding used for thermal management in a building trying to conserve heat without visible utility connection. The antenna array on the roof was different. 2 new installations flanked the original mast. That was not civilian equipment. Shen held the column. She was scanning the building. So was everyone else. Emily was scanning something different. She was looking at the secondary access point, the footpath down the north face that Shen had flagged as condition unknown. It was still there. The vegetation had grown over the entrance, but the grade was visible beneath it. Someone had moved through it recently. The grass was bent in one direction. She touched Shen's arm and pointed. Shen looked, nodded. They had been in position for approximately 40 seconds when the light inside the building changed. A thin line of illumination appeared along the sealed eastern wall. Not a window, but a gap. Something between the boarding and the original frame that had separated slightly. It was faint, the kind of light produced by a battery lamp or a very well-shielded artificial source, not the flicker of open flame. Someone was awake in there. Shen looked at Emily. Emily looked at the building, somewhere behind the sealed wall and the modified frame and the years of absence and the accumulated weight of everything she'd told herself about moving on. Something was waiting. She didn't know if it was Hargrove. She didn't know if the name Avery in that intercept was a code or a contact or something she was not ready to put language around yet. She knew the building. She knew the secondary medical bay in the western annex. She knew the roof access and the interior ladder and the eastern corridor that ran the full length of the structure and ended at a fire door that had always stuck slightly in wet weather. She knew that the light was coming from the third room on the left past that fire door. She knew because that was where they had always kept the generator backup, and because the backup had been wired to a specific outlet in that room as a failsafe, and because Marcus Avery had designed that failsafe himself and had shown her where it was on a Tuesday afternoon 7 years ago in the particular way he showed her everything, thoroughly, precisely, as if he expected her to need the information later. She looked at Shen. "I know which room that is," she said. Shen held her gaze. "Then let's go," she said. They moved toward the building, and the light inside did not change, and the ocean below the bluff kept producing its low, constant sound. And Emily Voss, who had once been someone else entirely, in a life she had spent 3 years pretending was fully behind her, walked toward the door she had walked through for the last time 7 years ago and had apparently never quite left. The fire door stuck exactly as she'd told them it would. Decker put his shoulder into it once, controlled, and it gave with a sound like a seal breaking, not loud, but in the silence of the building's interior, it felt loud, and everyone held for 3 seconds while the team processed the acoustic and nothing else moved inside. Shun signaled forward. They went in. The eastern corridor was narrower than Emily remembered, or seemed that way with 8 people moving through it in tactical formation. The walls were original, bare concrete block, the kind that sweated in wet weather, which this weather qualified as. Someone had strung a wire along the upper wall with small utility lights at intervals, the kind powered by battery packs, and 3 of the 5 were still functioning, which gave the corridor a dim, intermittent illumination that was better than darkness and worse than anything useful. Emily counted doors as they moved. 1, 2, storage had always been storage. 3, the junction that turned into the western annex. 4. And here Sheen stopped the column. The light was coming from under the door at the end, 5 meters ahead. Shun looked back at Emily, who held up 2 fingers and pointed at the wall. The light source was positioned in the far corner of that room, not the center. Shun nodded. She signaled Decker to the right of the door frame and took the left herself, and she looked at Emily and pointed her back down the corridor with a clear instruction in the gesture that said, "Stay here until I know what's in there." Emily stayed. Shun knocked. 3 times, evenly spaced, which was not a tactical knock. It was the knock of someone who knew that what was behind the door might be more fragile than dangerous. A pause. Then a voice, rough with disuse and something else, something physical, said, "Who's there?" It was not a question. It was the statement of someone who had been waiting for something to arrive for a long time and had made a decision in advance about how they were going to receive it. Shun said, "Captain Hargrove, my name is Captain Nora Shun. I'm coming in." She opened the door. Shut. Seth Hargrove was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall and a blanket across his legs and a battery lamp beside him that cast everything in flat yellow light. He was thinner than the photograph in his file, significantly, in the way people get thin when they've been managing calories for a long time rather than eating. His left arm was in a splint fashioned from what appeared to be a piece of equipment casing in torn fabric, bound at 2 points. He had a beard that had moved past deliberate and into the territory of someone who had simply stopped attending to it. His eyes, when they came up to Shun and then to the people filing in behind her, were alert in a way that looked like it cost him something to maintain. He looked past Shun. He looked past Decker and Priya. He looked at Emily, and something in his face moved. Not recognition exactly, because he had never met her, but something adjacent to it. The particular expression of someone seeing a piece of a puzzle they'd been holding in isolation finally connect to the rest. "Your Voss," he said. Emily came into the room. "Yes. Avery talked about you." He shifted, tried to sit up straighter, and the movement cost him. She could see it in the jaw tension, the way his breathing adjusted. He said, "If anything went wrong, you were the one who'd figure out how to fix it." "Let me see the arm," Emily said. "It's not—" "Captain." She was already crouching beside him, opening the kit. "I'm not asking." He let her look. The splint was actually reasonable work. Someone had known what they were doing, at least in the initial phase. But the injury was old, and the immobilization had shifted over time, and the soft tissue around the forearm was swollen in a pattern that suggested a fracture that had been moving slightly instead of healing. Not catastrophic, manageable, but painful in the persistent, wearing way that over weeks becomes a separate weight you carry on top of everything else. "How long?" she said. 6 weeks, give or take." "Who said it?" "I did." A pause. "Took 3 tries." Emily did not say anything about that. She began a systematic assessment, not just the arm, but the whole picture. Shun was talking to Hargrove, the operational debrief starting with controlled efficiency, and Emily worked alongside it without interfering, gathering what she needed to know medically, while Shun gathered what she needed to know tactically. Hargrove had been at Kessler Point for 22 months, not the entire 38 since his official death. There was a period in the middle that he summarized in a single sentence as moving around the coast, staying ahead of something, before Shen steered him back to timeline and specifics. He had gotten back to Kessler Point 14 months ago because it was the most defensible position he knew on this stretch of coast, and because it had infrastructure he could use. The generator backup, stored water filtration, a supply cache that had been concealed inside the Western Annex during his unit's original operation and which, apparently, had never been found during the official decommission. They didn't look very hard, Hargrove said. No, Shun said. They didn't. Because the people who signed off on the decommission were the same people who wanted the building empty for their own use. He said it without heat, the way someone says a thing they've had a long time to accept. They needed the site. They needed the supply chain that ran through it, and they needed everyone who knew the original operation to be unavailable. Define unavailable, Shun said. Dead, reassigned, discredited. He looked at his splinted arm for a moment. Or officially dead. Shun was quiet. Avery? Avery found the documentation 3 months before his accident. The word accident came out with a specific flatness. Financial records, supply manifests, routing data. There was a network using the abandoned coastal installations, not just Kessler, at least 4 sites, to move product. Not weapons, at the time. Materials. Equipment. The kind of surplus that walks out of a decommissioned installation and doesn't show up in the disposal records. Who was running it? Hargrove looked at her. How far up do you want to go? Shun did not flinch. All the way, he told her. Emily was redressing the splint with materials from the kit, her hands steady, her attention split between the task and the words in the room, and she heard 3 names that she processed and filed in the same cold, precise way she processed things that required later action. One of the names she had heard before. Once, in a context that had seemed administrative at the time, Avery had mentioned it in passing, briefly, in the way he mentioned things he wanted her to remember without making it obvious he was marking them for her memory. She understood now why he had done that. She finished the splint. Can you walk? Yes. He said it too quickly. On your own, I mean, without support. He paused. For a while. We'll manage. She looked at Shen. He needs a real facility within 8 hours. The arm can wait longer, but I'm seeing signs of caloric deficiency that are past the inconvenient stage. He needs IV access and fluids and monitoring. Understood. Shen was already on comms, low and efficient. Emily sat back on her heels and looked at Hargrove. Ranger found you. Something shifted behind his eyes. He's alive? He's at a vet facility in Calverton. He's stable. Hargrove closed his eyes briefly. It was the most unguarded thing she'd seen him do since they'd come in. He disappeared during the extraction. I thought... He stopped. He came back? He came to the hospital where I work. He had a tag. She paused. A tag with 2 letters of a name, M.A. Hargrove opened his eyes. I put that on him, before I sent him out. He looked at her. Avery left that tag here, in the supply cache. It was one of the things he'd been using as documentation, personal effects with serial data. He left it here on purpose, I think, in case someone got back to the site and needed to find the right person. The right person, Emily said. He said you were the only one outside the official structure who knew how the unit actually worked, that if the records got buried, you were the thread. He held her gaze. I didn't know how to find you, so I sent Ranger, and I told him to look for someone who handled him like they knew what they were doing. Emily was quiet for a moment. How did you know he'd find me specifically? I didn't, Hargrove said. Avery said Ranger would know. So, they got Hargrove to his feet 20 minutes later, with Decker taking his right side and Priya on the other, and they moved him out through the eastern corridor with Emily ahead and Shen behind, and the whole traverse of the building took longer than entry because Hargrove's stamina was real but limited, and they stopped twice to let him stabilize. His face during these stops was the face of someone managing pain through the familiar mechanism of refusing to let anyone see exactly how much of it there was. Emily recognized the mechanism. She'd used it herself. They were at the fire door when it happened. Priya, at the rear of the group, said one word through the comms. Contact. Everyone stopped. Shun was instantly back down the corridor, low, moving past them toward Priya. Emily had her hand on Hargrove's arm, and Decker had him against the wall, and the two of them held position without instruction, because position and silence were the obvious correct responses, and everyone in the corridor understood this. From outside, muffled through the concrete but audible, came the sound of a vehicle. Not on the road. On the bluff approach, the rough ground north of the building that had no formal track. Whoever it was had come off-road. Shun came back. Her face was contained. 2 vehicles. They cut their lights on the approach. She looked at Hargrove. You said the network had a monitoring protocol for this site. Periodic check-in. I've been spoofing a signal to mimic the automated beacon. He paused. But if they ran a physical inspection, they're running one now. Shen looked at Emily. Secondary access, the north path down the bluff. In the dark, it's a bad choice, Emily said. The grade is steep enough that without light they'll have to go slow, which gives us a window. Shen looked at Decker. Get him out. Emily, go with them. I need eyes on the north path while we buy you time. I know the building better than anyone on your team, Emily said. Yes, which is why you're going with Hargrove. If something happens to me in there, you're the one who can give Colonel Whitmore what she needs to close this. Shen looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had made a decision and was not reopening it. And you're his best medical chance if the extraction goes sideways. Emily looked at her for half a second. Okay. Move. They moved through the fire door and into the cold coastal air, and Emily heard Shen behind her directing the remaining operators through the building, voices low, disciplined, and then the door sealed and it was just Emily and Decker and Priya and Hargrove moving through the dark toward the tree line. The north path was exactly as degraded as Shen had predicted. What had been a clear trail 7 years ago was now mostly suggested by the angle of the terrain. The actual surface was overgrown and uneven, and in the dark, with a man who could not safely fall, they moved at a pace that felt tortuously slow against the sounds from the building behind them. 2 voices at one point, then silence. Then something that might have been movement inside the structure, too muffled to identify. Decker had a handlight with a red filter. He used it minimally, pointing it at the ground immediately ahead, shielding it with his body from the direction of the building. Priya was behind them, watching their 6 with the focused quiet of someone who had done this enough times that the fear had been fully converted into attention. Hargrove managed the path better than Emily had expected. I was in pain. She could hear it in his breathing, the slight irregularity that appeared at rough patches. But his footwork was deliberate, and he didn't grab at the supports offered to him except on the steepest section, where he took Decker's arm without being asked and released it the moment the grade leveled. They reached the shoreline at the base of the bluff as the sky behind the hills to the east was beginning to show the first gray of pre-dawn. Priya got on comms, spoke quietly. Listened. She looked at Emily. Shen has 2 contacts in the building, possibly 3. She's requesting backup. Dolan's vehicle is 12 minutes out. 12 minutes is a long time in a closed space, Emily said. She knows that. Hargrove sat down on a flat rock and put his head back against the bluff face. He was breathing hard but controlled. How many did you bring? He said. 8 plus Emily, Decker said. The network sends 4 on a physical inspection. If they brought more, it means the spoofed signal failed earlier than I thought, and they escalated. He looked at Decker. They'll have someone on the road. You drove in. Decker got on comms. There was a long moment. Then, from above them on the bluff, a sound that was not wind and not the ocean. Something structural, brief, coming from inside the building. Emily looked up. Then Shen's voice came through Priya's earpiece, and Emily was close enough to hear it even at low volume, and what Shen said was clipped and specific and carried the controlled edge of someone managing a situation that had moved past the planned parameters. 4 contacts confirmed. We have a 5th. They left someone at the north entry. Do not use the path. Repeat. Do not return via the north path. Priya acknowledged. Emily turned and looked at the bluff. From the bottom, in the gray early light, the building was invisible above the cliff edge. The ocean behind them moved against the rocks in the mechanical way it always did, indifferent, consistent, producing its sound whether or not anything above it was on fire. She's contained, Decker said. It was unclear whether this was a statement or a reassurance. She has 4 contacts in a building and no backup for 12 minutes, Emily said. She's also Captain Shen, Priya said quietly, from behind her. She's handled worse. Emily looked at the rock face. Is there another way up? Decker looked at her. Not on this face, he said. There's a road approach, but that's where Dolan is coming from. Emily looked at the rock face again. 7 years ago, before the footpath had been cleared and designated the official secondary access, the unit had used a different route. A fissure in the basalt on the northeast corner of the bluff that went up in a broken staircase of natural ledges, difficult in good conditions and serious in bad ones, but climbable by someone who knew where the holds were. She knew where the holds were. She had gone up and down it enough times in the first year of her posting that the sequence had become automatic. She had not climbed anything in 3 years. Her hands in the rock face and the cold and the dark were not a combination any reasonable person would look at and see as the correct choice. "There's a fissure," she said, "northeast corner. It tops out on the bluff about 40 meters from the building's north face." Decker looked at her with the expression of someone who understood exactly what she was proposing and was calculating whether to endorse it. "You've climbed it," he said, "in daylight, with both hands free." He looked at Hargrove. "Can you manage the rock without me?" Hargrove looked at him. "I managed 22 months without a functioning left arm. I'll manage 10 minutes on a rock." Decker looked at Emily. "Show me." The fissure was harder than memory. Memory tended to smooth things out, the specific difficulty of a particular hold, the way the basalt was wet in the morning damp, and how that changed every contact point, the physical reality of 36 in a body that had spent 3 years doing night shifts rather than field work. Emily went first because she knew the sequence, and Decker followed, and neither of them spoke because speaking took breath, and breath was not surplus. She came over the top of the bluff at the northeast corner with burning forearms and a deep cut on her left palm from a hold she'd misjudged in the dark, and she lay flat at the edge for 2 seconds before rolling and getting to her feet. The building was 40 meters away across open ground. The north face had a single figure standing at what had been the secondary entry point, Shen's reported fifth contact, and he was positioned to watch the path down the bluff, not the cliff edge. Decker came over the top beside her. She pointed. He assessed and nodded. What happened in the next 90 seconds was efficient and contained, and Emily stayed back because Decker had hand signals and angles she didn't have, and also because her left hand was bleeding in a way she was managing to ignore, but that was going to become relevant shortly. The figure at the north entry went down. Not permanently. Decker was precise about that in a way that registered clearly, but down and detained, quickly, and without producing enough noise to alert anyone still inside. Decker looked back at her and gestured toward the building. They went in through the north entry. The interior had changed. Not the structure was the same, but the quality of the air, the specific acoustic texture of a building that currently held 6 of Shen's operators and 4 hostile contacts in varying states of engagement was completely different from the building they'd left 12 minutes ago. Emily could hear voices, controlled, directional, and movement on the floor above them. She came through the north entry into the connecting corridor and saw Shen immediately. Shen was at the corridor junction, back to the wall, holding a zip tie in one hand and speaking low into her comms. She looked up when Emily appeared, and her face did something complicated. Not surprise exactly, but a rapid recalibration. "Northeast fissure," Emily said. "Decker's securing the north entry." Shen looked at her for a half second. "How's your hand?" Emily looked at it. "Fine. What's the status?" 3 contacts detained. 1 is in the western annex. He went in before we could close the corridor. Shen looked at the corridor leading west. "He knows the building. He's heading for the supply cache." "The documentation," Emily said. "If he gets to it first and destroys it." "He won't." Emily looked at the corridor. "The cache is behind a false panel in the annex storage room. He'd have to know exactly where to look and how to open it. It's not obvious." "Does he know the building the way you do?" "I don't know who he is." "His name is Weston," Shen said. "He was on the administrative staff of Installation 7. He was the logistics officer who signed off on the decommission." Emily looked at the western corridor. Weston had been the logistics officer. He had been in the building during the transition period. He might know the general location of the cache if he'd found any indication of it during decommission, but the false panel was Avery's work, and Avery had been specifically good at this kind of concealment. The panel had been built during the unit's operation and was not in any documentation that would have passed through a logistics officer's hands. But if Weston was in that room right now, going through it in a systematic search, he had time. And the panel was behind the 3rd rack of shelving on the north wall, and if he pulled the rack away from the wall— "Cover the corridor," Emily said, and she went. The western annex storage room was at the end of the side corridor, 30 feet from the junction. The door was open. She could hear movement inside, controlled, methodical, the sound of someone who knew roughly what they were looking for and was working through the space without panic. She went through the door. The man inside turned. He was mid-50s, heavy-set, wearing civilian gear. His expression moved through several stages quickly. Surprise, assessment, and then something harder. He was holding a flashlight and standing in front of the second shelving rack. He had not yet reached the third. "Stop," Emily said. He looked at her. She was in a vest with blood on her left hand and no weapon visible. He made a calculation she could see him making. "You don't have authority here," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I know exactly what's behind that panel, and I know exactly what Avery put in that cache, and I know exactly what names are in those documents." She took a step into the room. "And you know that the moment those documents leave this building, everything you've spent 6 years covering up ends." He moved for the third rack. She was closer. She got there first and put herself between him and the wall, and the next several seconds were not clean or cinematic. He grabbed her vest. She used the wall as leverage. They went sideways into the second rack, and it came down with a sound that surely carried through the entire building, and she had her right hand on his wrist and her knee against the shelving unit, and her left hand was doing nothing useful because the cut had gone deep enough that closing it on anything produced a pain that overrode the instruction from her brain. She heard Shun in the doorway behind her. "Weston, down, now!" He let go of Emily's vest. Emily stepped back, breathing hard, and looked at the panel in the wall. The third rack was still upright. The panel was intact. Shun had a zip tie on Weston in 12 seconds, and then looked at Emily. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." "Badly." "I know." Emily looked at the wall. "Get the panel open. Left side, third slat from the bottom. There's a release." Shen looked at her hand, made a decision, and found the release. The panel came open. Behind it, in a waterproof container that had been there for 6 years, were 3 external drives, 2 sealed evidence envelopes, and a handwritten log with a cover page in Marcus Avery's particular cramped handwriting. Shun stared at it. "Is this what I think it is?" she said. "It's everything," Emily said. "Avery spent the last 3 months of his life building a case. Names, transactions, routing records, witness statements, everything that would have ended the network if he'd had time to get it out." Shun reached for the container. "Don't," Emily said. "Chain of custody. You need Whitmore here before anyone touches that. The moment it's handled without proper documentation, every defense attorney in the country gets a crack at it." Shun pulled her hand back, looked at Emily. "You're right. Call Whitmore. Dolan's 12 minutes turned into, 5 minutes ago? 3. Shen got on comms. Emily looked at the container in the wall. 6 years. It had been sitting here for 6 years while she worked night shifts and filed the doubts, and told herself that moving on was the same as making peace with something. While Hargrove spent 22 months alone on a coast with a broken arm and a missing dog and a network of people who needed him to stay officially dead. While Ranger walked terrain that had damaged his paws repeatedly and found his way to a hospital in Calverton and dropped a tag at her feet. She heard vehicles outside. Whitmore arriving. Dolan. The sound of the operation expanding to its next phase, the phase where documentation was photographed and evidence was logged, and people in suits with federal authority started asking questions. Shun was talking into her comms, directing, managing, doing the things she was built to do. Emily sat down on the floor of the storage room with her back against the shelving unit and her right hand pressed over the cut on her left palm, and she looked at the open panel in the wall, and she thought about a Tuesday afternoon 7 years ago when Marcus Avery had walked her through the layout of a failsafe she'd thought at the time she would never need. She thought about what Hargrove had said. He said if anything went wrong, you were the one who'd figure out how to fix it. From somewhere in the building, she heard Whitmore's voice, the clipped, authoritative cadence of someone taking command of a scene. Footsteps in the corridor. Lights coming on in sections as the team secured the building methodically from east to west. She heard someone say Weston's name and then say 2 other names, and she recognized one of them, and understood in that moment exactly how high this was going to go. And the understanding was not satisfying, not yet, because the thing between documentation and consequence was a distance measured in months and proceedings, and the kind of institutional machinery that moved with its own timeline, regardless of what it had cost anyone to get the evidence inside it. She knew that. She pressed her palm harder. Shun came back to the doorway. She looked at Emily on the floor and for a moment did not say anything professional. "Your hand needs to be looked at," she said. "I know. Hargrove is secured. He's okay. Dolan's medic has him." "Good." Shen came into the room and crouched in front of her, looked at the hand, pulled a pressure dressing from her vest. Hold still. Emily held still. You went up the northeast fissure in the dark with a kid on your back, Shun said, working on the hand. I need you to understand that I'm going to put that in my report. It was the only option available. I know it was. Shun looked up at her briefly. That's why it's going in the report. From the corridor, Colonel Whitmore appeared in the storage room doorway. She looked at Emily on the floor. She looked at the open panel. She looked at the container inside it with the drives and the envelopes and the log in Avery's handwriting. Her face did something Emily didn't have a clean word for. Avery built a dead man's switch, Whitmore said quietly. He built it, and he put her inside it, Sheen said, not looking up from Emily's hand. She was the switch. Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. We need federal authorization before anyone touches that container, Emily said. Already called, Whitmore said. 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Emily looked at the panel. In 20 minutes, the chain of custody would begin. The drives would be cataloged. The log would be read by people with the authority to act on what it contained. The names Hargrove had told Shun in the third room on the left. Past the fire door would be cross-referenced against the documentation in that container, and the cross-reference would produce a case that 6 years of deliberate burial had failed to prevent. But Whitmore's expression had not fully resolved. She was still looking at the container with something that wasn't just relief. What is it? Emily said. Whitmore looked at her. The third drive. The label on the outside. Emily hadn't been close enough to read the labels. She looked at Shen, who looked at Whitmore. Whitmore said, It says Voss. Just that. Your name. His handwriting. The room was very quiet. He made a separate file on me, Emily said. Or for you. Whitmore's voice was careful. We won't know until authorization clears and we can open it. She paused. But Emily, Avery labeled that drive before he died, which means he knew 6 years ago that you were going to be the one to find it. Emily looked at the panel. Outside the building, the coast was fully in pre-dawn now, that gray into pewter light that preceded actual sunrise by 20 minutes and made everything look like a photograph of itself. She could hear the ocean. She could hear the team moving through the building with the professional efficiency of people who had done this in worse conditions. She could hear, distantly, the sound of federal vehicles on the coastal road coming down from the highway. She thought about the drive with her name on it. She thought about what Marcus Avery had known 6 years ago that she was only now beginning to understand. And then she heard something else, beneath all of it, beneath the footsteps and the radio traffic and the ocean and the approaching vehicles, a sound she almost dismissed as the building settling in the morning cold. But it wasn't the building. It was coming from the eastern corridor. Shen heard it too. She was on her feet before Emily had finished processing it, hand on her sidearm, moving toward the storage room door. That room should be clear, Shun said, low. It is clear, Decker's voice came through her comms from somewhere in the building. All contacts are accounted for. Then what is that? Shun said. She went into the corridor. Emily came behind her. The sound was coming from the third room on the left past the fire door, the room where they'd found Hargrove, the room that should now be empty. Shun pushed the door open. The battery lamp was still on, still casting its flat yellow light. There was someone in the room, not Hargrove, not anyone Emily had seen before. A man sitting in the corner, hands zip-tied in front of him, head down, breathing shallowly. Who had been there, in that room, the entire time they had been in the building, unseen because he had been behind the equipment rack in the corner and they had not cleared that corner because they had been focused on Hargrove and had not been looking for a second person. He lifted his head. Emily looked at him, and the world rearranged itself around her in a way she had no prepared response for, because the man in the corner was thin and weathered and had been in this building for a very long time. And she recognized him in the way you recognize something you've told yourself for 6 years is gone permanently, with a shock that wasn't loud and wasn't dramatic, but was simply the sudden collapse of a structure you'd built your entire present on. Marcus Avery looked at her. Took you a while, he said. Emily stood in the doorway and did not move for 3 full seconds. That was the honest accounting of it. 3 seconds in which every mechanism she had built over 6 years, the practical identity, the filed doubts, the night shifts, and the clean records, and the deliberate forward motion, ran directly into the fact of Marcus Avery sitting in the corner of a room in a building on the Oregon coast with his hands zip-tied in front of him, looking at her with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a specific thing to happen and has just watched it happen. Shen had her weapon half drawn and then didn't draw it, because the man in the corner was restrained and breathing shallowly and clearly. Not a threat in any immediate physical sense, and threat assessment was Shen's first reflex. Emily's first reflex was different. It was the reflex of someone looking at a dead man who was not dead, trying to locate the point at which the last 6 years became a different story than the one she'd been living. "Who zip-tied you?" she said. Her voice came out level. She was mildly surprised by that. "Weston's people," Avery said, "when they came in ahead of you. They found me in the annex and moved me here." He looked at his wrists. "They were planning to deal with me after they found the cash." Shen was already on comms. "Whitmore, 3rd room east corridor, you need to come here now." Emily came into the room. She crouched in front of him the way she had crouched in front of Hargrove, not because she made a conscious decision to do so, but because assessing the physical condition of the person in front of her was the thing her hands and eyes knew to do when the rest of her was still processing. She looked at his hands, his face, his color, his breathing. He was thin, like Hargrove, but not the same kind of thin. This was older depletion, a longer duration. His eyes were clear, his color was poor. He had a healing laceration above his right eyebrow that was at least 2 weeks old and had not been properly closed. "How long have you been here?" she said. "At Kessler Point? 8 days. He paused. "I've been moving around the coast since the accident." He said accident the same way Hargrove had. "Mostly coastal communities, small enough to stay invisible." 6 years, Emily said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You let me believe you were dead for 6 years. He held her gaze. "I know." "That's not an explanation." "No." He shifted slightly, and the movement cost him more than the same movement would have cost a healthy man. "It was the only way to keep you outside the target set. If they believed you knew nothing and had no connection to the documentation, they had no reason to move on you. The moment you started pulling threads..." He stopped. "The moment I started pulling threads, I became a liability," she said. "Yes." "So you protected me by not telling me you were alive." "I protected you by making sure your name was on the 3rd drive." He looked at her steadily. "Everything in that drive is your clearance, your record from our unit, the commendations that were never processed, the testimony I recorded about your role in the operation and your conduct and your professional standing. If the network had ever moved on you, that drive was the documentation of exactly what you were and exactly what they'd be doing to an innocent person." He paused. "And if you found the cash first, it was the first thing you'd see with your name on it, and you'd know the rest of the container was legitimate." Emily was quiet. "You used my name as authentication," she said. "I used your name as the key," he said, "because you were the only person I fully trusted to use it correctly." She sat back on her heels. The cut on her left palm was throbbing now that the adrenaline was settling and Shen's pressure dressing was the only thing managing it. "I want to be angry at you," she said. "I know. You should be." "I am." She looked at him. "I also need to assess your condition, so hold still." Behind her, she heard Whitmore come through the door now. What followed was not clean. It never was, when a situation had been running at operational pressure for 12 hours and then expanded suddenly in scope. The moment Whitmore saw Avery, the entire command structure of the mission had to recalibrate simultaneously, and recalibration under those conditions produced friction. Whitmore was composed about it, which was the best that could be said. She stood in the doorway and looked at a man whose death she had apparently never fully believed in either. And she said nothing for a long moment, and then she said, "Get him medical," which was the correct priority. Emily stayed with Avery while Dolan's medic came in and they worked together on the immediate picture: dehydration, the laceration above the eye that needed proper closure, a rib injury on the right side that had healed badly and was producing referred pain he had been managing without telling anyone. He was functional. He was not fine. "You're going to tell me when something hurts," Emily said, pressing along his rib cage with controlled pressure. "I've been managing." "I know what you've been managing. Tell me when something hurts." He told her when something hurt. The federal authorization for the evidence container came through at 6:47 a.m. 2 agents from the Office of Inspector General, who had apparently been on a 4 a.m. call from Whitmore's command structure and had driven down from Portland in the pre-dawn, arrived with documentation and stood in the storage room with gloves and cataloging equipment and processed the container with the methodical precision of people who understood that every step in the next 48 hours was going to be scrutinized. Emily was not in the room for that. She was in the eastern corridor with Avery, sitting across from him on an overturned equipment case while Dolan's medic finished closing the laceration, watching Avery's face and thinking about what 6 years of deliberate absence looked like from the other side. "The third drive," she said. "Yes. My military record. The commendations. Your medical record from the unit. Your performance documentation. 3 written statements from operators you treated, 2 of them senior, which matters for the review board." He looked at her. "Your discharge was processed as a voluntary separation. It wasn't. You were pressured out. The record needs to reflect what actually happened." She looked at the floor. "I didn't fight it." "You had no grounds to fight it on at the time. They'd removed the documentation." He paused. "The grounds are in that drive." She thought about the Hartwell night shifts, the 3 years of competent invisibility, the charge nurse's assessment, technically competent but hard to read, the way she had converted everything she was into something smaller and more portable and less visible, and had told herself that was called moving on. "You knew I'd end up somewhere like this," she said. "I knew you'd end up somewhere you were underutilized," he said. "I knew the work would be good. I wasn't sure whether you'd still be angry or whether you'd let it go." "Which would you have preferred?" He almost smiled. It was small, and it was tired, and it was the most familiar thing she'd seen in a very long time. The angry version is harder to lose track of. By 8 a.m., the structure at Kessler Point was fully under federal control. The transition from Special Operations Tactical to Federal Investigative was not seamless. These things never were, and the two cultures operated with different tempos and different notions of what constituted adequate documentation of a scene. She managed the handoff with the weary professionalism of someone who had navigated this particular interface before, and she did it without losing anything critical, which was the actual measure of success. Weston had been separated from the other detained contacts and was in a federal vehicle on the coastal road, and even from inside the building, Emily could identify the approximate moment he realized that the evidence cache had been secured before he'd reached it, because there was a period of sustained vocal activity from the direction of that vehicle that carried even through concrete walls. The 3 other contacts had been identified by Hargrove during his debrief with Shen, cross-referenced against Avery's documentation, and 2 of them matched names that appeared in the financial records on the first drive in ways that the OIG agents described to Whitmore as comprehensive, which was the word they used when they meant it was better than they'd expected, and they were already building the case architecture in their heads. The names in the case architecture went higher than Weston. Emily learned this incrementally, in the way you learn things when you're moving between tasks in a secured building and pieces of information. Reach you through partially overheard conversations and deliberate briefings, and the expressions on the faces of people who are seeing something come into focus. She was checking Hargrove's arm when Whitmore came in and told them both that the second drive contained communications records going back 4 years, and that 2 of the names in those records held current positions in the regional military administrative structure. Hargrove looked at Whitmore. "How current?" "One of them was involved in the resource allocation review that denied our search request 18 months ago," Whitmore said. "The request to conduct a physical assessment of the coastal installations." The room was quiet. "He denied the search request from inside the network," Shun said. "She was in the doorway. Nobody had told her to be there, but the information was relevant to her, and she had positioned herself accordingly." "That's what the communications record suggests," Whitmore said. "That's obstruction of a federal investigation on top of the underlying network offenses," Shun said. "That's significantly more than obstruction," Whitmore said. Her voice was flat in the particular way of someone containing something large. "The OIG is contacting the Attorney General's office this morning." Emily thought about the 18 months Hargrove had spent on this coast after that search request was denied. The continued depletion. The fractured arm set 3 times in field conditions. The dog sent out alone because there was no other option. She thought about the person who had reviewed a request to search for a man who was officially dead but plausibly alive, and had denied it, and had done so from inside the structure that benefited from that man staying unfound. She kept her hands on Hargrove's arm, and kept working. They moved Hargrove and Avery to a medical facility in Westmark, 60 miles north, by 9:15, not Hartwell General, a federal medical unit attached to a military installation which had the advantages of secure access and staff with appropriate clearances and equipment that didn't require explanation. Emily went with them. She had not been told to. Nobody had told her not to. She had simply gotten into the vehicle because the alternative was standing in a building on the Oregon coast, while other people handled the subsequent phases of something she had been part of from the beginning, and that was not a thing she was capable of doing. Dolan drove. Shen was in the second vehicle. Avery was in the back with Emily, and Hargrove was in the first vehicle with the medic, and the convoy moved north on 101 through morning that had become actual daylight, gray and damp in the way of the Oregon coast in early spring, with the Pacific visible intermittently through breaks in the tree line on the left. Avery slept for 20 minutes and then woke up abruptly the way people do when they've been sleeping in conditions that require alert waking. "We're on 101, Emily said. "Northbound. You're safe." He took a breath, looked out the window. "How's Hargrove?" "He'll need orthopedic intervention on the arm. He's otherwise intact." She paused. "He sent Ranger to me." "I know. He told me when he found me in the annex 3 days ago." Avery looked at her. "He didn't know who I was at first. We had a very tense 24 hours before he believed me." "You were both at Kessler Point and didn't know the other one was there." "He was using the main structure. I was in the annex." A pause. "We were both being very careful about noise." Emily looked at him. It was almost, not quite, but almost funny, and the almost funny quality of it was specifically the kind of thing that happened in situations that had been too serious for too long and found their release in small, absurd details. "Ranger knew," she said. "Ranger always knew," Avery said. "That's why Hargrove trusted him to find the right person. He's the only honest intelligence asset in the whole operation." Outside, the ocean appeared and disappeared between the trees. "The drive with my name," Emily said. "The record. The commendations." She paused. "What board did you mean when you said review board?" He looked at her steadily. "Your separation needs to be reclassified. Voluntary doesn't cover what happened, and you know it." He paused. "The documentation supports an appeal and a formal review of your service record. What you do with that is your decision, but the grounds exist now." "That takes time." "Yes." "Months, possibly more." "Yes." She looked at the road. "And in the meantime, I'm a night shift nurse at a regional hospital." "In the meantime, you're the person whose testimony and direct knowledge of Kessler Point made this morning possible," he said. "Start there." She didn't answer immediately. She thought about what it had felt like to work on Hargrove in that room, and on Avery in the corridor, and on the fissure climb in the storage room and the accumulated mechanics of the last 12 hours. And she thought about how none of it had felt like something she used to be able to do. It had felt like something she did. Present tense. The way the watch on her wrist was always present tense, regardless of where she wore it. "You owe me 6 years of explanation," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm aware. I'm going to collect on that. I expected you would." The federal medical facility in Westmark processed Hargrove and Avery with the efficiency of a unit that had been briefed ahead of arrival and had the appropriate personnel standing by. Emily gave the receiving physician a full handoff on both patients, complete, documented, verbal, and written. And then she stood in the facility corridor and felt the specific deflation that follows a sustained operational period when the immediate demands finally stop arriving. Her left hand hurt. The pressure dressing needed changing. She found a supply room, changed the dressing herself, sat on a metal stool for approximately 4 minutes, and then got up and went to find Whitmore. Whitmore was in a conference room with 2 OIG agents and a woman Emily didn't recognize who turned out to be from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland. She came in without knocking because the door was open and she had information the room needed, and Whitmore looked up and gestured her to a chair without breaking the sentence she was completing. Emily sat. The picture being assembled in that room was significant. The network had been operating for a minimum of 7 years, using the decommissioned coastal installations as waypoints for a supply chain that had evolved from equipment misappropriation into something considerably more organized. By year 3, it had civilian contractors involved. By year 5, it had moved into financial instruments. Misappropriated federal procurement funds being cycled through shell accounts attached to the contractor infrastructure. The military administrative figures whose names appeared in Avery's communications records were not peripheral to the operation. They were the architecture. Weston was mid-level, useful, documentable, and now in federal custody, which made him the pressure point. "He'll want to deal," the attorney said. She was precise in the way of people who had been doing this long enough to find it boring. His exposure is significant. If the communications records are as comprehensive as you're describing, he has nothing to offer on the underlying case except corroboration. "Corroboration still has value," one of the OIG agents said. "At this level, you don't need his corroboration. You have Avery's documentation, Hargrove's testimony, and a physical site with material evidence. Weston's deal value is marginal." She paused. "Unless he has something on the individuals above him that isn't in the existing record." "We don't know yet what isn't in the existing record," Whitmore said. "Then that's the first conversation you have with him." The attorney looked at her notes. "Who else was in the building?" Whitmore went through the detained contacts systematically. Emily listened. When Whitmore reached the third contact, a man named Farrow, who had been on Weston's team and had been identified by Hargrove as the logistics coordinator for the supply chain's coastal phase. Emily noted the attorney's response, which was a very slight adjustment of posture that indicated the name meant something to her. "Farrow," the attorney said. "Yes." "He was named in a separate investigation 18 months ago, procurement irregularities at a federal contractor in the Portland area. The case was closed for insufficient evidence." She looked at Whitmore. "I'd like very much to know if the evidence that was found insufficient then is the same evidence that's now sitting in your drives from Kessler Point." Whitmore looked at Emily. Emily had been in the room for 7 minutes and had not yet said anything, and the attorney now looked at her for the first time. "This is Emily Voss," Whitmore said. "She was the primary medical specialist in the unit at Kessler Point. She's the individual who located and secured the evidence cache this morning." The attorney assessed her in the brisk, non-personal way of someone who spent most of her time assessing things. "You know the content of the drives?" "I know what Avery told me he put on them," Emily said. "I haven't reviewed them directly. But if the first drive has supply manifests going back 7 years, and Farrow was the logistics coordinator for the coastal phase from year 3 onward, then yes. The documentation on the first drive almost certainly covers the same period and the same transactions as your 18-month-old case. Which means the evidence that wasn't sufficient 18 months ago was sufficient," Emily said. "It just wasn't all there." The attorney looked at her for a moment. "Who made the determination of insufficient evidence?" Nobody answered immediately. Emily thought about the denied search request. The name Whitmore had given her in the federal medical vehicle, the name that belonged to someone currently holding a position in the regional military administrative structure. "I think," Emily said carefully, "that's a question for the second drive." The attorney looked at Whitmore. Whitmore nodded once. The OIG agent who had been quieter reached forward and opened his laptop. The second drive took 4 hours to work through with appropriate documentation protocols, because the OIG agents were not going to produce a case that defense attorneys could challenge on process, and every file was cataloged and chain of custody documented before it was opened and reviewed. Emily was not in the room for all of this. She was fed at some point. Someone put a sandwich in front of her and she ate it without particular attention. And she checked on Hargrove, who was post-surgical on the arm and sleeping with the depth of someone whose body had finally received the signal that the immediate crisis had passed. She checked on Avery. He was in a room with an IV line and a monitor, and he was awake, looking at the ceiling, and when she came in, he turned his head and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been thinking about a specific thing. "The second drive," he said. "They're going through it." "The communications records on that drive go to someone you've heard of," he said. "Someone you met once, at a regional command function, about 8 years ago." Emily thought. "Garfield." "General Darrell Garfield," Avery said, "who has spent the last 6 years in increasingly senior administrative positions, the most recent of which involves oversight of federal procurement for military installations in the Pacific Northwest." Emily sat in the chair beside the bed. "He's been in procurement oversight," she said, "while the network was using misappropriated procurement funds. He wasn't just adjacent to it," Avery said. "He designed the financial mechanism. The communications on that drive include architecture documents in his handwriting, Digital, but in his syntax, his organizational logic. I've read enough of his administrative writing to know it. He paused. I couldn't prove it without the drives. I couldn't get the drives out without being officially dead. I couldn't stay officially dead indefinitely. He looked at her. This was always going to converge at some point. I just didn't know when or who would be standing in the room when it did. You knew it would be me, Emily said. I hoped it would be you, he said. There's a difference. She looked at the IV line, the monitor, the healing laceration above his eye that was still visibly recent against the older wear of his face. When they review the second drive, she said, and they find Garfield's name, they'll find it within the first 20 files. He was not cautious. He believed the network was insulated by the seniority of its participants. Avery looked at the ceiling. Seniority is only insulation while the documentation stays buried. Emily thought about Garfield. She had met him once. A regional command function, as Avery said. She had been there in her unit capacity, managing the medical logistics for the event. Garfield had been a colonel at that point. She remembered him as someone who occupied authority with the comfort of a person who had never seriously had it questioned. She was thinking about this when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Whitmore. She answered. They found it, Whitmore said, to create the Garfield communications. 23 files spanning 4 years. The OIG lead called it, and I'm using her exact words, the most documented senior-level network participation she's seen in 14 years of this work. A pause. We're moving on Garfield this afternoon. Emily was quiet. Emily. Whitmore's voice shifted slightly. He's in Portland. He's currently attending a procurement conference at a federal building downtown. Another pause. With 43 other senior military and civilian administrative figures. The specific weight of that landed. 43 people. A procurement conference. The man who had architected the financial mechanism of a network that had falsified casualty records, buried evidence, kept 2 men isolated on the Oregon coast for years, and systematically dismantled the careers of anyone who got close enough to threaten it, sitting in a conference room in a federal building downtown, discussing procurement processes. They're going to arrest him at the conference, Emily said. The U.S. Attorney is coordinating with the FBI field office right now, Whitmore said. Public location, multiple witnesses, full documentation already in federal custody. There's no play for concealment or pressure on witnesses at this stage. The case is too complete. A pause. I thought you should know before it happened. Thank you, Emily said. She ended the call and sat for a moment. Avery was watching her. Garfield, he said, this afternoon. She looked at him. Public arrest? Federal building in Portland. Something moved through his face that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too clean for what 6 years of deliberate absence cost. But it was adjacent to relief in a way that she recognized as the expression of a person whose long bet had finally paid out in the specific currency they'd needed. Good, he said, quietly. The arrest happened at 2:17 p.m. Emily was not there. She was in the federal medical facility in Westmark, sitting in a corridor with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching a news alert appear on her phone. Because the FBI field office in Portland had apparently not been as quiet about the timing as they might have been, and a reporter had been in the building for the conference and had been in the right place when the agents came in. The alert said, Senior military official arrested at federal procurement conference. Sources cite classified evidence recovered in coastal operation. No names yet. Names would come. She put the phone face down on the chair beside her. Sheen sat down next to her. She had changed out of tactical gear into something that looked like borrowed civilian clothes, and she had the look of someone who had been running on operational adrenaline for 16 hours and was starting to feel the withdrawal. It's done, Shun said. The arrest is done, Emily said. The case has a long way to go. Yes. Shen looked at the wall across from them. But the evidence is in custody. Garfield is in custody. Weston's talking. The attorney confirmed 40 minutes ago. He took the deal offer and started giving names immediately. She paused. Once Weston talks, everyone downstream of him in the network has about 72 hours before their exposure is fully documented. Emily looked at the phone face down on the chair. 72 hours. The machinery was moving now, and it would move at its own pace. The depositions, the warrants, the parallel cases built on Weston's cooperation, and the evidence drives and Hargrove's testimony and Avery's recordings and the physical site at Kessler Point. It would move for months, possibly longer, but it was moving. "The record review," Shun said. "For your service record." She looked at Emily. "Whitmore is going to initiate it formally. She told me to tell you. Officially. In writing, with supporting documentation from the third drive and Avery's testimony." Shun paused. "She said it should have happened years ago, and she's sorry it didn't." Emily looked at the cold coffee. "She doesn't need to apologize," Emily said. "She didn't know." "No," Shun said. "But she knows now, and she's going to do something about it, which is all you can actually ask of anyone." Emily sat with that. From the room at the end of the corridor, she could hear the quiet sounds of monitoring equipment. Hargrove's room, the steady measured confirmation that his systems were stable and recovering. From the room 2 doors closer, nothing, because Avery was sleeping now, finally, the deep practical sleep of someone whose body had finally received all the information it needed to begin the actual work of repair. She thought about Ranger, in the veterinary facility on Powell Street in Calverton, oriented east. His mission complete in some dog-specific sense that she didn't have the language for but understood. She thought about the drive with her name on it. She thought about what it meant that Avery had built it before his disappearance, before the years of absence, before any of what happened after, had built it as both protection and authentication, had trusted that the architecture of the situation would eventually bring her to the place where she could use it. She had thought about her service record for 3 years without intending to. The thought had been there in the background the way background thoughts were. Not active, not demanding, but persistent. The shape of something that wasn't finished. Now it was going to be looked at. Formally. With documentation and authorization and the names of senior people attached to the request. She should have felt something clean about that. Instead, she felt the complex, unsatisfying texture of something that was unambiguously right, but was also 3 years late and 6 years of someone she trusted being dead and not dead, and the accumulated weight of all of it arriving at once. Her phone buzzed again. She turned it over. It was not a news alert. It was a message from a number she didn't recognize, and the message was 3 words and a question mark, and the 3 words were names. 2 of them she recognized from Avery's documentation, and 1 of them she did not recognize. And that was the one that stopped her, because it was not a name from the network, and it was not a name from her unit, and it was not a name from any part of this operation that she had encountered in the last 16 hours. It was her name, her old name. The name she had held before the voluntary separation, before the civilian records, before Hartwell General and the night shifts and the 3 years of determined forward motion. The message said, Voss, Kelmer, Ashbridge, still breathing? She stared at it. Kelmer and Ashbridge had been on the second drive. Communications contacts within the network, names the OIG was currently working through. Someone in the network knew she was here. Someone in the network had just contacted her directly, using a name she had not used in 3 years, to tell her that they knew Kelmer and Ashbridge were in the documentation, and to ask whether she was still alive to testify about it. She looked up. The corridor was empty except for Shen. "Shen," she said. Hun looked at her. Emily held out the phone. Shen read the message. Her face went through a rapid sequence that ended in controlled stillness. "Someone in the network flagged you," Shen said, "which means they have access to information about this morning's operation." "Which means," Emily said, "that someone with access to this morning's operation is feeding information to the network." The corridor was very quiet. Shen was already reaching for her own phone, already composing the message to Whitmore, her face arranged in the expression of someone dealing with the specific and unpleasant discovery that a situation they thought was closing had just opened a new room. Emily looked at the message on her phone, 3 names, hers included. The network had been running for 7 years. It had survived Avery's disappearance and Hargrove's isolation and the buried evidence and the denied search requests. It had survived Weston's arrest this morning. And now someone inside it, someone with current access to operational information, had just told her directly that they knew she was still breathing. Shun made the call to Whitmore in 40 seconds flat. She stepped 6 feet down the corridor, kept her voice low, and her sentences short, and Emily listened to one side of a conversation that carried the controlled urgency of someone delivering unwelcome information to a superior who needed to act on it immediately. Whitmore asked 2 questions. Shen answered them. The call lasted under 2 minutes. Then Shen came back and looked at Emily with the expression of someone who had just reconfigured their understanding of the current situation and was already building the next response to it. She's locking down the facility, Shen said. Nobody in or out without her direct authorization until we identify the source. The message used my old designation, Emily said. That narrows the source pool. My pre-civilian identity isn't in any current operational record. It would have to come from someone with access to the original unit documentation, or from someone who was read into this morning's operation and cross-referenced it against something older. How old is that designation? 9 years. It predates my separation by 2 years. Shen thought about this. So either the network has retained documentation from the original Kessler Point operation, which Avery believed they did. He said they pulled records during the decommission, Emily said. Or someone on today's team has a connection to the network that goes back further than this morning. Shen did not look comfortable with either option. She shouldn't have. Neither was a comfortable thing to be true. Stay here, Shen said. I'm not going anywhere. Shen went toward the facility entrance. Emily looked at the phone in her hand. The message was still on the screen. 3 names, one of them hers, the question mark at the end that was not really a question. It was a statement dressed as a question, a signal that someone wanted her to know she'd been seen. She did something then that was either sensible or reckless, and she didn't have enough information yet to know which. She screenshotted the message, forwarded it to Whitmore's number, and then replied to the unknown sender with 2 words. Still here. She put the phone in her pocket and waited. Whitmore arrived at the facility at 3:40 p.m., and the person who came with her was not Dolan and was not anyone from the morning's operational team. It was a woman named Special Agent Kara Rosenthal from the FBI's Internal Security Division, and Rosenthal had the particular kind of stillness that Emily associated with people who spent most of their professional time looking for things that were hidden inside structures that were supposed to be trustworthy. Rosenthal did not introduce herself with warmth. She introduced herself with her credentials and a specific question. The message came in at 2:41 p.m., she said, standing in the corridor outside Avery's room. 14 minutes before Weston formally confirmed cooperation with the U.S. Attorney's Office. 14 minutes before that information was transmitted to anyone outside the prosecution team. She looked at Emily. Which means whoever sent you that message did not get the Weston information from the prosecution side. They got it from somewhere else. From the network itself, Emily said. From someone who knew Weston's arrest was coming, knew cooperation was likely, and sent you a preemptive signal before the official information moved. Rosenthal paused. That means they're fast, well connected within the network's own communication structure, and they chose to contact you rather than disappear. Why would they contact me? Emily said. That's what I need you to help me understand. Rosenthal looked at her steadily. The message includes Kelmer and Ashbridge. Both names appear in the second drive documentation. What's your connection to either of them? None that I know of. I didn't recognize those names before I saw them in the drive summary. But they're in the network's documentation paired with your designation. Rosenthal looked at her phone briefly. Which suggests the network flagged you at some point. Possibly when you were still active in the unit, possibly more recently. Emily thought about the supply chain anomalies she'd reported twice in the last year of her posting, the ones that had been explained as administrative error. Someone in the network would have seen those reports, seen her name on them, and made a note. I reported irregularities in the unit's supply chain before my separation, she said, twice, through the reporting structure. Both times it was dismissed. But the reports would have been visible to anyone monitoring the administrative feed. So they knew about you 9 years ago, Rosenthal said. They tracked your separation, your civilian transition. And when this morning happened, someone in the network pulled that old flag and decided to make contact. To warn me, Emily said, or to warn themselves by warning me. Rosenthal looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. Explain that. If someone inside the network wants out, if they've been in it long enough to know what Weston's cooperation means for everyone downstream, contacting me is a way of signaling that they have information worth trading. They used my name to show they have access. They used Kelmer and Ashbridge to show they know which names are currently in play. Emily looked at the phone. That's not a threat. That's an opening bid. Rosenthal was quiet for 4 seconds. You've done this before. I've been on the receiving end of how these networks communicate. Emily looked at her. The question mark at the end, still breathing. They're not asking if I'm alive. They're asking if I'm in a position to receive. Rosenthal looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at Emily. Can you respond in a way that keeps them engaged long enough for us to identify the source? Rosenthal said. I already replied, Emily said. Rosenthal's stillness shifted slightly. You replied. 2 words. Still here. It's neutral enough to mean anything and specific enough to confirm I received it. She looked at Rosenthal. If they're genuine, they'll respond with something substantive. If they're testing whether I'm being monitored, they'll go quiet and we learn something from the silence. Rosenthal looked at her for a long moment. You did that before I arrived? Yes. Another pause. Without authorization. I'm a civilian. I don't operate under your authorization structure. Emily held her gaze. And if I'd waited for the authorization conversation, the window would have closed. Rosenthal did not appear to enjoy this answer. She also did not appear to have a counter-argument for it, which was a different thing. Let me have the phone, she said. Emily handed it over. The response came at 4:52 p.m. Rosenthal's team had the number traced within 40 minutes of receiving the device. Not to a person, not yet, but to a cell tower in the Portland metro area, which narrowed it geographically, and given that Garfield's arrest had occurred in Portland at 2:17, put the sender in the same city as the highest value target currently in federal custody. The message said, Garfield didn't build it alone. The architect is still outside. I can give you Brennan. Rosenthal read it and showed it to Whitmore without expression. Whitmore said, Who's Brennan? Not in the drive documentation, one of Rosenthal's team said from down the corridor, laptop open. No Brennan in any of the Kessler Point materials. Emily looked at the message. Brennan isn't in the unit documentation either. That name never came up during my posting. Which means either this person is fabricating, inflating their value to buy leverage, or Brennan is someone the documentation doesn't reach, Rosenthal said. Someone above Garfield in the architecture. The room was very quiet. Garfield designed the financial mechanism, Emily said. That's what Avery told me. But designing the mechanism isn't the same as authorizing it. Someone gave Garfield the framework to work within. Someone with enough authority to make sure the denial of the search request 18 months ago didn't raise flags above the regional level. Whitmore looked at her. That's not regional authority, Whitmore said. No, Emily said. It's not. Rosenthal was already making a call. What followed was 3 hours that Emily spent mostly in the corridor, receiving information in pieces, assembling it the way she assembled a clinical picture, incrementally, without rushing the conclusion, allowing the evidence to determine the shape rather than imposing a shape on the evidence. Rosenthal's team worked the source trace. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Portland was brought into the Brennan question. Weston, who had been talking for 2 hours by that point, was asked specifically about the name, and his response, which Rosenthal received via text and read twice before showing Whitmore, apparently confirmed that Brennan existed and was not peripheral. At 7:20 p.m., Rosenthal came to where Emily was sitting in the corridor and said, The source made contact through a second channel. They want a meeting. With me specifically? With you, by name. Old designation. Rosenthal looked at her. They're not willing to meet with federal agents. Emily looked at the wall across from her. They want a civilian. They want someone they perceive as outside the structure that's been compromised. Rosenthal paused. Which is either a reasonable operational instinct or a setup. Where? Calverton. They suggested a public location. Rosenthal held out a piece of paper. This coffee shop. Emily looked at the address on the paper. It was Marta's. The same coffee shop where she'd met Whitmore at 4 in the morning, approximately 16 hours ago, which was also approximately 16 years ago in terms of how much had happened since. They know where you met Whitmore this morning, Rosenthal said. That's the point. They're demonstrating access. And choosing a location I'll feel some control in, Emily said, which means they've thought about my psychology. Are you willing to go? Emily looked at the paper. She thought about what Avery had said. He said if anything went wrong, you were the one who'd figure out how to fix it. She thought about 6 years of not quite putting it down. The watch on her wrist. The way she had never fully stopped being the person she'd been trained to be, even while doing everything available to her to live as someone else. Yes, she said, with conditions. The meeting was at 9 p.m. Marta's had three other customers when Emily arrived, a couple near the front window who were either on a late date or a tense reconciliation, and a man by himself with a book who had been there long enough that his coffee was finished. The single overhead light that had always buzzed slightly still buzzed. The same employee was behind the counter. Emily took the back corner table again. She had a wire, which she had agreed to as Rosenthal's condition for authorizing the meeting. Rosenthal's team was in two vehicles on the street outside. Shun was in the car 2 blocks north. The protocol was simple. If Emily signaled distress, the room would fill within 90 seconds. She ordered coffee. It arrived. She didn't drink it. At 9:07, a man came in. He was in his mid-40s, average height, unremarkable in the specific way of someone who had spent a career cultivating unremarkability. He wore a jacket that was too warm for the weather inside, but made sense for someone who'd come in from the rain. He scanned the room with the practiced non-obviousness of someone accustomed to reading environments quickly, and he found Emily in the corner, and he came over and sat down without being invited. "Voss," he said. "You have a name?" she said. "Calloway." He looked at the table. "I was a contracting officer at the regional procurement office. I've been in the network for 3 years. He said it the way someone says something they've been rehearsing. Flat, deliberate, as if the flatness is the only way to get through it. I didn't know what it was when I went in. By the time I understood it, I had enough exposure that getting out wasn't simple. "But you're here," Emily said. "Garfield's arrest changed the math." He looked at her directly. "Garfield is the face. Brennan is the engine. If Garfield cooperates, Brennan will manage the exposure, which means Garfield won't cooperate for long, and anyone Garfield can name, Brennan will move on." He paused. "I'm in that set." "Who is Brennan?" "Deputy Director Lawrence Brennan. Federal Procurement Oversight, national level. He's been in that position for 4 years, and for 3 of those years, the network's financial structure has been running through contracting mechanisms he controls directly." Calloway looked at the table. "Garfield built the regional architecture. Brennan made sure the federal-level auditing never found it." Emily kept her face neutral. "You said you can give us Brennan." "I have documentation. I've been keeping my own records for 14 months. Insurance." He reached into his jacket and put a USB drive on the table between them. 3 years of contracting records, cross-referenced against the network's actual supply movements. Brennan's authorization signatures appear on 47 procurement actions that correspond exactly to network logistics events. He looked at her. "That's not correlation. That's a pattern that any forensic accountant will read in 40 minutes. Emily looked at the drive. "Why me?" she said. "Why not go directly to the FBI?" "Because the FBI field office that opened the Farrow case 18 months ago had its finding reviewed by Brennan's office before it was closed," Calloway said. "I don't know who in the field office is clean." He paused. "You came in from outside. You're not inside any of the structures that have been compromised. You're the only person I could identify in this situation who has no institutional footprint Brennan can read." Emily picked up the drive. "If this is what you say it is," she said, "you're going to have to testify." He looked at the table. "I know. Your cooperation will be public record. Your prior participation in the network will be public record." "I know." He met her eyes. "I've been sitting on this for 14 months trying to find a way out that didn't cost everything. There isn't one." He paused. "There's only the version where I wait until Brennan moves on me, or the version where I move first." Emily put the drive in her pocket. "Stay here," she said. "Don't go anywhere. I'm going to make a call." She walked to the back of the coffee shop, near the door to the utility area, and spoke quietly to Rosenthal through the wire. The response came in her earpiece 45 seconds later. Rosenthal's team was coming in. The drive would be taken into custody. Calloway would be taken into protective custody, which was a more comfortable version of the same thing. When she came back to the table, Calloway was looking at the front door with the expression of someone who had made a decision they couldn't unmake and were now simply waiting for the consequences to begin arriving. "It's going to be okay," Emily said. She said it not because it was a guarantee, but because it was the only thing available that was both honest and human, and she had learned a long time ago that sometimes people needed to hear the thing that was almost true more than they needed the complete and accurate picture all at once. Rosenthal came through the door at 9:19. Lawrence Brennan was arrested at 6:15 a.m. the following morning at his residence in Bethesda, Maryland. Emily learned this from Whitmore, who called her at 6:42 while she was sitting in the Westmark facility cafeteria with cold coffee. She seemed to be getting a lot of mileage out of cold coffee this week, and who delivered the information with the contained satisfaction of someone for whom this particular outcome had been a long time coming. Calloway's documentation was comprehensive, Whitmore said. Rosenthal's team worked through the night, 47 procurement actions, all cross-referenced and verified against the network records from Avery's drives. The forensic accountant apparently used the phrase exceptionally clear, which I understand is unusual for that context. Brennan's lawyers will challenge the sourcing, Emily said. Yes, and they'll lose because the sourcing is clean and the chain of custody is clean and the documentation from 3 independent sources, Avery's drives, Hargrove's testimony, and Calloway's records, converge on the same transactions. Whitmore paused. This is over, Emily. The prosecution will take time. The proceedings will take time. But the network is broken. Every major participant is either in custody or in cooperation. There's no one left with the authority or the access to manage the exposure. Emily looked at the cafeteria window. Morning again. Another damp Oregon morning, lighter than yesterday, with actual sun trying to exist behind the cloud layer. The record review, she said. I filed the formal initiation this morning. Before Brennan's arrest, actually. I filed it at 5 a.m. A pause. I wanted it on record before the day got complicated. Emily was quiet. There's something else, Whitmore said. The review board convenes in 6 weeks, standard timeline given the documentation we have. Avery will provide written testimony. Hargrove has already agreed to provide a statement about your conduct during the Kessler Point operation. Another pause, shorter. I'll be providing one as well, based on the last 48 hours. Colonel, don't. Whitmore's voice was firm, but not unkind. You went up the northeast fissure of a coastal bluff in the dark with a compromised hand and located a network contact without authorization and handed us the connection to Brennan. You did all of that as a civilian nurse with no active standing. She paused. The review board is going to have a very easy job. Emily sat with that for a moment. The cafeteria was beginning to fill with the early shift staff from the facility, people in scrubs, people carrying trays, people engaged in the small transactions of a workday morning, ordinary and functional and real. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Whitmore said. Thank me in 6 weeks. She went to see Avery at 8 a.m. He was sitting up, which was progress from the previous afternoon. The IV had been converted to a port, and the monitor was showing numbers that belonged to someone whose body was beginning to do what it was supposed to do when given appropriate conditions. He looked better in the way that people looked better the day after crisis, which was not all the way better but was directionally correct. She sat in the chair and told him about Calloway and Brennan, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Brennan, he said. I didn't have his name. No, it wasn't in your documentation. I knew the architecture went above Garfield. I couldn't reach it from inside what I had. He looked at the window. Calloway had it. Calloway had been building his own exit for 14 months, Emily said. He just needed a door. Avery looked at her. You were the door. Apparently I'm a door now, she said. He almost smiled again. The same small, tired version from the vehicle. How's your hand? She looked at the dressing. It needs to be looked at properly. You should let someone look at it properly. I'm aware. She paused. I'll get to it. Emily, she looked up. I know what I cost you, he said. The 6 years, the record, He stopped, started again. There wasn't a version I could see where telling you the truth kept you safe. That's what I told myself. I've had a long time to examine whether that was accurate or whether it was the version of the truth that was most convenient for my operational requirements. He looked at her. I'm not certain I got that right. She held his gaze. You didn't, she said, but I understand the calculation you made. And I've been making my own calculations for 6 years about whether to pull the thread or leave it. I didn't pull it. She paused. Ranger pulled it. Yes, Avery said. So we were both waiting for something external to move us. She looked at the window. That's a human problem, not a you problem. He was quiet. When you're discharged, she said, We're going to have a longer version of this conversation. I know. I have things to say to you that I'm not going to say in a federal medical facility. That seems fair. She stood up. I'm going to get my hand looked at. Good. She was at the door when he said her name. She turned. The record review, he said. Whatever they offer you after. You don't have to take it because you feel like you've been waiting for it. He paused. You built something real at Hartwell, night shifts and all. That counts too. She looked at him for a moment. I know it does, she said. She went to see Ranger 3 days later. The veterinary facility on Powell Street in Calverton was a different universe from where she'd spent the last 72 hours, which was partly why she needed to go there. The staff knew her by now. She had called twice to check on him, and the attending veterinarian had given her updates with the tone of someone who understood that the person calling was not asking about a dog in any casual sense. Ranger was in a recovery enclosure in the back, which the veterinarian led her to without ceremony. His leg had been properly assessed. The soft tissue tear was healing, would heal completely given time and appropriate management, and he had been eating, which was the most important thing. When she came through the door of the recovery room, he lifted his head. Then he was on his feet, and she was on her knees on the floor of a veterinary facility at 9 in the morning without having made any conscious decision to get there, and Ranger put his head against her chest with the full weight of it, and she put both arms around him, and they stayed like that for a while. It was not dignified. She did not particularly care. Hey, she said, you did good. He made a sound against her that was not a whine and not a bark, and that she understood as clearly as language. I know, she said. Me too. The review board convened on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks later in a federal building in Portland, 3 blocks from where Garfield had been arrested. Emily sat in a waiting room for 40 minutes before she was called in. She was not in a uniform. She hadn't worn one in 9 years, and she was not going to perform the wearing of one for the purpose of the proceeding. She wore a dark jacket and the watch and the particular posture that had never fully left her, and that she had stopped trying to negotiate with. The board was 3 people. She recognized one of them from the documentation review, a senior officer who had been pulled in from the national level, specifically because the regional administrative structure was too compromised to provide impartial oversight. The other 2 were strangers. They asked her questions for 2 hours. She answered all of them. At the end of the 2 hours, the senior officer looked at her across the table and said, "The record as filed does not reflect your actual service. We're going to fix that." Emily said, "I know." He looked at her. "Is there anything you want to say for the record before we close the session?" She thought about what she wanted to say. She had thought about it on the drive here and the night before, and the 40 minutes in the waiting room. She had considered several versions of a prepared statement and discarded all of them because they were too clean, too resolved, too much like the ending of something, rather than the accurate description of what 6 years of doing the work quietly without recognition actually felt like from the inside. "I want it on record," she said, "that the work I did at Hartwell General Hospital was not a lesser version of anything. I was good at it. The patients I treated received good care. The fact that it happened to be the cover I was living under does not change that it was also real." She paused. "I don't want the record correction to read as if the last 3 years were a waiting room. They weren't." The senior officer looked at her for a moment. "Noted," he said, and he wrote something down. Garfield entered a guilty plea 9 weeks after his arrest. Weston had been cooperating for 6 of those 9 weeks, and by the time the plea was entered, the case against Garfield was so thoroughly documented that his legal team spent most of their time negotiating the terms of the plea rather than contesting the underlying facts. The plea was accepted on a Thursday morning. It covered procurement fraud, obstruction, falsification of military records, and conspiracy. The sentencing was scheduled for 8 weeks out. Brennan did not plead. Brennan contested everything, as people in his position tended to do when they had resources and the particular confidence that came from spending 20 years in positions where accountability was always someone else's problem. His legal team filed motions. The prosecution answered them. The process moved at the pace of a large thing moving through a resistant medium, which is to say slowly, inevitably, and with a great deal of friction. But it moved, Calloway testified in the preliminary proceedings 6 weeks after the coffee shop meeting. He sat in a federal courtroom in Portland and answered questions for 4 hours, and his documentation was entered into evidence, and the cross-examination from Brennan's team produced nothing that damaged the substance of what he had to say, because the documentation was not the kind of thing you could argue with by attacking the person who collected it. Emily was in the courtroom for Calloway's testimony. She had not been required to be there. She went because she thought someone should, and because she understood in some specific way that Calloway had walked through the door she'd held open and deserved to have someone present who knew the full cost of that decision. He saw her when he came out of the courtroom. He stopped. "How'd it go?" she asked. "It went," he said. She nodded. That was the accurate version. Hargrove was discharged from the federal medical facility on a Wednesday, cleared by the orthopedic surgeon with instructions and a follow-up schedule and the information that the arm would be fully functional in 4 to 6 months with appropriate rehabilitation. He walked out of the building into a gray Westmark morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the street. Emily was there. She had driven up from Calverton. He looked at her and then at the street and then back at her. "You didn't have to come." "I know," she said. "I would have been fine." "Probably," she agreed. He looked at the sky. There was actual sun today, which felt significant and probably wasn't. "Where's Ranger?" "With me. He's in the car." Hargrove looked at her. Something shifted in his face that he didn't try to manage. He went to the car. Ranger was in the back seat, and when the door opened, the sound he made was a sound Emily had not heard him make before. Not the low, purposeful sounds of a dog on a mission, but something older and more uncomplicated than that. Hargrove sat in the back seat with him for a while. Emily leaned against the car and looked at the street. Avery was discharged the following week. He came to Calverton, which he said was because it was where the situation had converged, and therefore where the unfinished conversations were. And Emily suspected he also had nowhere else to go that felt right yet, that the concept of somewhere that felt right was going to require some reconstruction, and Calverton was as good a starting point as any. They had the longer version of the conversation she'd promised him. It took most of an evening and was not comfortable for significant portions of it. And at one point she said something that she hadn't planned to say, which was that the hardest thing about the 6 years was not the grief for him, but the way his absence had made her doubt her own read of things. If she'd been wrong about his death, what else had she been wrong about? And she'd responded to that doubt by compressing herself, making her world smaller and more controllable, limiting her exposure to anything that would require her to trust her own judgment in high-stakes situations, because the cost of being wrong again was not something she had figured out how to bear. Avery listened to this without interrupting, which was one of the things she had always respected about him. "You weren't wrong," he said, "about any of it. The supply chain anomalies, the pressure to separate, the shape of his death. You read it correctly. You had no mechanism to act on it, but you read it correctly." "I know that now," she said. "Did you know it then?" She thought about it honestly. 50-50, she said. He nodded. "That's the part I'm sorry for. The 50 where you weren't sure." They sat with that. "Ranger knew," she said eventually. Avery looked at the dog, who was asleep on Emily's floor with the specific depth of an animal who had completed a very long task and had been given warmth and food, and someone nearby and had decided these things were sufficient. "Ranger always had better intelligence than everyone around him," he said. "He found me," she said. "You designed a system and Hargrove executed a decision, and Ranger walked a coastline for 3 years and walked into a hospital and found me." She looked at the dog. "Whatever any of us did right, that's the part that actually worked." Avery looked at the dog for a while. "What are you going to do?" he said. "After the record is corrected." "Whitmore offered me something," Emily said. "A consulting role. Medical and operational planning for unit-level deployment in the Pacific region. It's advisory, not active. I can keep my nursing license, keep working clinically if I want to." She paused. "I haven't decided." "What are you waiting for?" She thought about it. "I want to make sure I'm deciding towards something," she said, "not away from what I've been doing." He looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," she said. "There's a significant difference." She paused. "Hartwell wasn't a failure. I want to be clear about that. The night shifts, the patients, the work. That was real, and it was good, and I am not going to rewrite it as the years I wasted waiting to be discovered." Nobody said, I know nobody said it. I'm saying it because I need to be the one who says it first. She looked at him. The story that happens to people like me, the one where you disappear into obscurity and then circumstances force you back into the light, and then everyone realizes you were worth something the whole time. That story has a version where the obscurity was waste. I don't accept that version. She looked at the window. I helped people. At Hartwell. Real people, on bad nights, when they needed someone competent to be in the room. That had nothing to do with anyone recognizing it. Avery was quiet. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. 6 years, she said, give or take. The record correction was formalized on a Friday afternoon. A letter arrived at her apartment on Heron Street, paper, official, with the appropriate letterheads and signatures and the particular language of institutional acknowledgement that was simultaneously too formal to feel personal and the only mechanism available for saying, in an official capacity, that a wrong had been named and addressed. Her service record was corrected. Her separation was reclassified. The commendations Avery had recorded and documented were formally entered. 3 additional commendations were added by the review board based on the testimony provided during the 6-week proceeding. She read the letter at her kitchen table. She put it down. She picked it up and read it again. Then she put it on the table next to the plant near the west window, the one that was alive because it was designed for neglect. And she went to the window and looked at the hills above Calverton and stayed there for a while. She had not cried during any of the preceding 9 weeks, which was a fact she was aware of without particular judgment. She had been moving, always something to do, always the next thing, always the forward motion that was both her best mechanism and the thing that could, if she wasn't careful, become a way of never arriving anywhere. She cried now. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone releasing something cinematic and conclusive, in the way of someone who has been holding a specific weight for a specific number of years and has finally been given actual grounds to put it down, and is discovering in the moment of putting it down how heavy it was. It didn't last long. When it was done, she washed her face, put on her jacket, and went to get Ranger from the veterinary facility where he'd had his follow-up appointment, and she walked home with him through a Calverton afternoon that was, for once, not raining. She took the consulting role. She told Whitmore on a Monday morning in a phone call that lasted 6 minutes because she didn't require preamble, and Whitmore didn't either. And the terms were what Whitmore had outlined, and Emily had spent 2 weeks examining from multiple angles. She also kept her nursing license. She went back to Hartwell once, on a Tuesday afternoon, not officially. She walked through the ER entrance and said hello to Torres, who was on the day shift and who looked at her with the particular expression of someone encountering a person in a context that no longer matches their category. She said hello to Deborah, who said, with characteristic neutrality, that the night shifts had been adequately covered, but that the new person folded the trauma kit wrong. She didn't stay long. She was not trying to reclaim anything there. She was visiting something that had been real, to confirm to herself that it remained real, and then she was going to go forward. The forward was the point. She understood now, in a way that was less clean than she'd have liked it to be, that the years at Hartwell had not been the cost of what happened to her. They had been what she did with herself when the structure she'd built her professional identity within was taken from her. She had done them well. She had helped people. She had gotten up on bad nights and cold mornings and done the work that needed doing, and nobody had seen it in any formal sense, and it had mattered anyway. That was the thing she wanted to hold on to, not the correction, not the commendations or the reclassified record or the letter on the kitchen table. The fact that the work had mattered before anyone acknowledged it, and would have gone on mattering even if Ranger had found someone else's feet to drop the tag at. You don't become worth something when someone finally recognizes it. You were worth something the entire time they were failing to look. The recognition is not the point. The recognition is just what happens when the truth becomes too large to keep ignoring. And the truth, in this case, had been 70 pounds of German Shepherd with damaged paws and a mission nobody had sanctioned, walking past every other person in a hospital and stopping in front of a tired nurse at the end of a bad night shift. Because he knew. Long before anyone else was willing to. Emily walked out of Hartwell General into the afternoon, and Ranger was waiting for her outside the entrance, and he fell into step beside her without being asked, and neither of them was searching for anything anymore.